They say the most dangerous weapon in a woman's arsenal isn't a blade or a bullet, it's a story. We are conditioned to believe in the archetypes of the feminine, the nurturer, the muse, the fragile swan gliding across a stage of glass. We want to believe that grace is synonymous with goodness. But what happens when that grace is a choreographed lie? What happens when the damsel in distress is actually the one holding the script? And the gun? In the sun-drenched quiet of Bradenton, Florida, the air usually carries the scent of salt and suburban peace. But in September 2020, that peace was shattered by 4 shots that sounded less like a tragedy and more like a final calculated curtain call. Ashley Benefield, a former ballerina with the porcelain skin and wide-eyed innocence of a stage heroine, stepped out of the shadows of her mother's home, claiming she had no choice. She played the part of the victim with the precision of a prima ballerina. She spoke of monsters, of fear, of a desperate need to protect. But as the echoes of those shots faded, a darker narrative began to emerge from the wings. This wasn't a story of self-defense. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. A slow, deliberate transformation where the white tutu was stained crimson by a black swan, who decided that her husband was no longer a partner, but a prop that needed to be permanently removed from the stage. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the woman Ashley Benefield became, one must first understand the world she built for herself, a world of aesthetics, discipline, and the pursuit of a flawless exterior. Born Ashley Summer Rose, her very name suggested something delicate, something meant to be admired in a garden or under a spotlight. From a young age, the rigors of the ballet world defined her. This is a world where pain is hidden behind a smile, where every muscle is trained to perform under pressure, and where the image presented to the audience is far more important than the reality behind the curtain. Ballet isn't just a dance, it's a psychological conditioning. It teaches you how to mask exhaustion with grace, how to ignore a bleeding toe for the sake of the performance, and most importantly, how to control how the world perceives you. Ashley was a master of this control. Those who knew her in her early years saw a driven, beautiful young woman who seemed to carry an aura of ethereal innocence. She was the girl who looked like she needed protection, yet possessed a steely internal resolve that few could penetrate. By her early 20s, Ashley was living in Maryland, working in the high-stakes, high-glamour world of professional dance and political consulting. She was a connector, a woman who moved through rooms of powerful people with the ease of a veteran socialite. She didn't just walk into a room, she made an entrance. Her beauty was her currency, but her true power lay in her ability to mirror the desires of those around her. To the ambitious, she was a partner. To the lonely, she was a sanctuary. It was in this world of polished surfaces that she met Doug Benefield in 2016. Doug was a 58-year-old widower, a man whose life had been recently upended by the sudden death of his wife of 30 years. He was successful, wealthy, and deeply grieving, a man looking for a second act, a reason to believe in beauty again. He was the perfect audience for Ashley's performance. When Ashley, then just 24, met Doug at a campaign event, the age gap of 34 years didn't seem like a hurdle. It seemed like a fairy tale. To Doug, she was a miracle. She was a pure soul who shared his Christian values and his passion for the arts. He saw her as a fragile flower that needed his strength and his resources to truly bloom. For Ashley, Doug represented something else entirely: stability, a benefactor, and a stage upon which she could build her greatest production yet. The romance was a whirlwind, the kind that leaves no room for the slow, messy reality of getting to know someone's flaws. Within just 13 days of meeting, Doug was convinced he had found his soulmate. He was a man accustomed to making big moves in the business world, and he applied that same aggressive momentum to his heart. They were married in a small, private ceremony that felt like a secret shared between two people against the world. In those early months, the image was perfect. Doug was the doting husband, showering Ashley with gifts and the promise of a dream. They would start a ballet company together. It would be the American National Ballet, a grand, prestigious institution that would cement Ashley's legacy in the world of dance. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a merger of his money and her ambition. But beneath the surface of this suburban dream, the cracks were already forming, though they were invisible to the naked eye. Ashley began to curate a specific narrative of their life. She wasn't just a wife, she was a woman living in a gilded cage. To her friends and family, she began to drop small, subtle hints that Doug's devotion was actually a form of suffocation. She didn't start with accusations of violence, she started with the optics of control. She painted a picture of a man who was too intense, too overbearing, too much. The ordinary woman persona was her greatest defense. She presented herself as a simple, God-fearing girl who wanted nothing more than a quiet life and a career in dance. She didn't drink, she didn't party, and she spoke in the soft, melodic tones of someone who wouldn't hurt a fly. But as the dream of the ballet company began to falter, burdened by financial mismanagement and the impossible expectations Ashley had set, the mask began to slip. When the white swan realizes the stage isn't big enough for two, the transformation begins. Ashley didn't just want to leave Doug, she wanted to erase the version of herself that belonged to him. She began to see him not as a provider, but as a liability. And in the mind of a woman trained from birth to perform, a liability is something that must be edited out of the script. The transformation from the loving, fragile bride to the calculating architect of a husband's demise didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate series of steps, choreographed with the precision of a professional, leading inevitably to a final, fatal movement. The honeymoon period didn't just end, it evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical atmosphere of suspicion. As the initial glitter of their 13-day romance wore off, the reality of the American National Ballet, ANB, began to crumble. Doug had poured millions into Ashley's dream, but the company was a house of cards. Dancers weren't being paid, the prestigious board of directors was resigning, and the artistic vision was a chaotic mess. But in Ashley's mind, the failure of the company wasn't due to her lack of experience. It was Doug's fault. He became the scapegoat for every broken promise and every professional setback. It was during this period of professional decay that Ashley became pregnant. In a healthy relationship, a child is a bond. In the hands of a manipulator, a child is a weapon. The pregnancy changed the chemistry of their conflict. Ashley shifted her performance from the inspirational artist to the terrified mother. She began to view Doug not as a husband, but as an obstacle to the total, uninhibited control she craved over her unborn daughter. The cracks in the marriage became canyons. Ashley's behavior grew increasingly erratic, but it was always framed through the lens of a woman in fear. She started a pattern that experts often call the silver bullet, a tactical use of false or exaggerated abuse allegations to secure a win in custody battles. She began making reports to the authorities, claiming Doug was aggressive, that he was poisoning her, and that he was a danger to her and the baby. She wasn't just arguing with him, she was building a file. Every interaction was a potential piece of evidence. She would record him, bait him, and then present the resulting frustration as proof of his instability. Yet, the evidence rarely matched her narrative. Police would arrive at their home to find a calm, albeit confused, Doug and an Ashley who was perfectly composed, spinning a web of subtle, terrifying accusations. When their daughter was born, the warfare intensified. Ashley moved to her mother's home in Bradenton, Florida, effectively kidnapping the child from the family home in South Carolina. She began a relentless campaign to erase Doug from his daughter's life. She filed for divorce, requested multiple restraining orders, and leveled the most heinous accusations a man can face, alleging that Doug had not only been abusive to her, but was a physical threat to the infant. However, The legal system, often criticized for its slow pace, began to see through the Black Swan's performance. Judge after judge found her claims to be unsubstantiated. There were no bruises, no medical records of poisoning, no credible witnesses to the monster she described. In fact, a court-appointed psychologist noted that Ashley seemed to be the one displaying alienating behavior, deliberately trying to sever the bond between father and child for no legitimate reason. Despite the mounting legal losses and the weight of her false claims, Doug remained hopelessly, tragically devoted. He was a man who believed in redemption. He believed that if he could just show her enough love, enough patience, and enough financial support, the old Ashley, the girl he fell in love with, would return. He followed her to Florida, renting an apartment nearby, hoping to co-parent and perhaps even reconcile. This was the fatal mistake. Doug's refusal to go away, his refusal to be erased, drove Ashley into a corner. By the late summer of 2020, her legal options were running out. A judge had recently ruled that Doug was entitled to unsupervised visitation with his daughter. To Ashley, this was a death sentence for her control. If the law wouldn't protect her narrative, she would have to take the law into her own hands. The motive was never about money, though she had spent plenty of his. It was about the absolute ownership of a human life, her daughter. She had spent years crafting the image of a victim, a woman fleeing a predator. If she allowed Doug to be a father, if she allowed him to be part of the girl's life, her entire performance would be exposed as a lie. She had reached the final act of her play. The script now required a villain to be vanquished and a hero to be vindicated by self-defense. In her mind, she wasn't planning a murder. She was planning an ending. She began to talk more frequently about her fear, telling her mother and neighbors that she was living in terror. She was setting the stage, adjusting the lighting, and preparing the audience for the tragedy that was about to unfold. She didn't want a divorce. She wanted a disappearance. And on a humid September evening, as Doug arrived at her mother's house to help her pack for a planned move to Maryland, a move he believed was a fresh start for them, he walked right into the center of her crosshairs. September 27th, 2020. The Florida heat hung heavy over Bradenton, a thick, stagnant humidity that seemed to press against the windows of Eva Bristow's home. Inside, the atmosphere was even more stifling. Doug Benefield had arrived that afternoon with a U-Haul truck and a heart full of cautious optimism. He believed this was the day they were finally moving to Maryland to start over. A new house, a new state, a new chance to be a family. He had no way of knowing that while he was planning a future, Ashley was finalizing an ending. The afternoon was a blur of domesticity. The packing of boxes, the tape gun's sharp zip echoing through the hallways. To any neighbor glancing through the window, it looked like a typical family transition. But the sensory details within the house told a different story. There was no music playing, no shared laughter, just the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the floorboards and the soft, deliberate footsteps of a woman who had already decided this was the last time she would ever see him alive. At approximately 6:45 p.m., the Black Swan prepared for her final solo. Eva, Ashley's mother, had taken the toddler for a walk to a nearby park, leaving the couple alone. This was the window. Ballistics and the subsequent investigation would later reconstruct the scene, stripping away Ashley's polished narrative to reveal the raw, clinical reality of the violence. Doug was in the bedroom, likely bending over a box or turned away, distracted by the mundane tasks of packing. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighing nearly 200 pounds, but in that moment, he was completely vulnerable. Ashley reached for her .45 caliber handgun, a weapon she had recently practiced with at a local range. She didn't hesitate. She didn't scream for help. She didn't try to run out the front door into the safety of the neighborhood. The first shot tore through the silence of the suburban evening. The bullet struck Doug in the leg. It was a debilitating wound. one that would have sent him to the ground instantly. But Ashley wasn't finished. As Doug struggled, his body twisting in a desperate, instinctive attempt to comprehend the betrayal, she fired again. This time, the bullet entered his right arm. Then a third shot. This was the fatal blow. The heavy point, .45 caliber round entered his chest, piercing his lung and heart. The sound of the gunfire was deafening in the small room. The smell of acrid cordite filled the air, mixing with the scent of cardboard and packing tape. Doug collapsed, his life spilling out onto the floor of the room where he thought he was building a home. He was facing away or sideways from her when the lead entered his body. There were no defensive wounds on Ashley, no scratches on her face, no bruises on her arms, no signs of a desperate struggle for a weapon. Her hair was perfectly in place, her clothes were untumbled. Minutes later, Ashley walked out of the house. She didn't call 911 immediately. She walked to a neighbor's house, her face a mask of calculated distress. When the call finally went through, she didn't sound like a woman who had just survived a life-or-death struggle. She sounded like someone reciting a script she had rehearsed in her head for months. "I had to shoot him," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling with just the right amount of practiced frailty. "He was attacking me. I was so scared." When the first responders arrived, they found Doug still alive, though barely. He was lying in a pool of his own blood, his eyes fixed on nothing, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. He couldn't speak. He couldn't tell them that he had been shot in the back. He couldn't explain that he had come there to help her. He died an hour later at the hospital, the victim of a damsel who had decided that the only way to keep her child was to ensure her husband never drew another breath. Back at the house, Ashley stood on the lawn, the flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers reflecting in her wide, pale eyes. To the officers on the scene, she was the picture of a traumatized victim. She played the part perfectly, leaning into the role of the battered woman who had finally been pushed to the edge. But as the forensic teams began to move into the house, the stage she had set started to fall apart. The bullets didn't lie. The angles of entry didn't match her story. The Black Swan had performed her final act, but she had forgotten one crucial detail. The crime scene is a witness that cannot be manipulated. She played the part of the grieving, terrified mother with a conviction that was almost hypnotic. She spoke of a man who had stalked her, a man whose shadow loomed over her life like a permanent eclipse. To the initial patrol officers, she was a survivor. She pointed to the aggression of the move, the intensity in Doug's eyes. She stayed in the character of the victim so deeply that it seemed even she believed the lines she was delivering. But as the initial shock wore off and the detectives from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office began to look past the porcelain mask, the cracks in her story weren't just visible, they were glaring. The first suspicion arose from the silence of the scene. In a true life-and-death struggle, the kind Ashley described, there is chaos. Furniture is overturned, there are scuff marks on the walls, and, most tellingly, there are defensive wounds. Detectives looked at Ashley's hands. They were pristine. No broken fingernails from clawing at an attacker, no bruises on her forearms from blocking a blow, no redness around her throat. She looked less like a woman who had fought for her life and more like a woman who had just finished a dress rehearsal. Then came the ballistics. The science of a crime scene is an unbiased witness, and in this case, it was shouting. Ashley had claimed Doug was lunging at her, that he was a physical threat in that very moment. But the trajectories of the bullets told a different story, a story of a man who was potentially turning away, perhaps even retreating. One bullet had entered his side, another his leg, and the fatal shot struck him while his body was positioned in a way that made a frontal assault impossible. The math simply didn't add up to self-defense. It added up to an execution. While the detectives were crunching numbers and analyzing blood spatter, Ashley was busy outside the interrogation room. She didn't hide. Instead, she leaned into the public's perception of her. She utilized the black swan persona to her advantage, moving through her social circles as a tragic figure. To her supporters, she was a hero who had protected her child from a predator. She was the face of domestic violence awareness, a living testament to the dangers of toxic men. But behind the scenes, the investigators were digging into her past. They found the trail of failed restraining orders. They found the transcripts from family court judges who had already labeled her an alienator. They realized that the victim narrative wasn't something that started the night of the shooting. It was a long con, a psychological campaign that had been years in the making. Suspicion turned to certainty when they analyzed her behavior in the hours after Doug's death. There was no grief, only a calculated concern for her legal standing. She wasn't asking about her husband's final moments. She was asking about the silver bullet defense. She was obsessed with the optics. The community began to split. In the local coffee shops and on social media, the debate raged. Was she a fragile dancer who finally snapped under the weight of abuse, or was she a cold-blooded manipulator who had used her beauty as a silencer? The term Black Swan began to circulate, no longer as a tribute to her talent, but as a description of her nature, something beautiful that hides a dark, predatory instinct. As weeks turned into months, the damsel in distress act began to wear thin. The detectives realized that Ashley hadn't just shot Doug. She had tried to assassinate his character long before she pulled the trigger. Every medicine bottle she claimed he used to poison her was tested and found to be harmless. Every threat she documented was scrutinized and found to be a fabrication or a provocation on her part. The most damning suspicion, however, was the why of the timing. The move to Maryland, the court-ordered visitation, the realization that Doug was never going to stop being a father. The investigators saw the motive clearly. Ashley didn't want to be a co-parent. She wanted to be the sole author of her daughter's life. And in her world, there was no room for a co-star. The mask was still on, but the audience, the men in suits with badges and legal pads, was no longer clapping. They were waiting. They were watching the way she moved, the way she spoke, and the way she never, not once, showed a flicker of genuine remorse for the man who had loved her to death. The first suspicions had solidified into a leaden reality. The fragile swan was a predator, and the stage was being set for a very different kind of performance, one where the state of Florida would call her what she truly was. The wheels of justice in Manatee County didn't turn with the frantic energy of a chase. They turned with the slow, crushing weight of a steamroller. For 17 days after the smoke cleared in that Bradenton bedroom, Ashley Benefield remained a free woman. She walked among the community, a survivor in the eyes of many, while the detectives of the sheriff's office retreated into a world of physics, biology, and digital footprints. They weren't looking at the girl. They were looking at the lead. The investigation centered on a concept known in legal circles as the silver bullet. It's a term used to describe a tactical, often false allegation of domestic violence or child abuse intended to end a custody battle with one decisive blow. Detectives realized that Ashley hadn't just fired a gun on September 27th. She had been firing silver bullets for years. They began by meticulously debunking her diary of terror. Ashley had claimed Doug was poisoning her with heavy metals. The lab results? Negative. She claimed he had physically assaulted her on multiple occasions. The police reports? Each time officers arrived, there was no evidence of injury, no witnesses, and often Ashley's own story shifted under the slightest pressure. She had even alleged that Doug had punched a dog and thrown a loaded gun, claims that, when scrutinized, lacked any corroborating physical evidence or consistent testimony. Then, the forensics team delivered the final blow to her self-defense narrative. In a standard stand your ground or self-defense case, the physical evidence usually shows a face-to-face confrontation. But the ballistics report on Doug Benefield was chillingly inconsistent with Ashley's story. She claimed he was charging her with his arms up, like a monster in a horror film. However, the path of the bullets told a different story. One round had entered Doug's right leg, from the side. Another had entered his right arm while it was down, not raised in a threat. Most damning of all, the fatal shot had entered his chest at an angle that suggested he was turning away or falling, not lunging forward. The evidence doesn't just suggest she wasn't in danger, one investigator noted. It suggests she was the one closing the distance while he was trying to figure out why his wife was pointing a .45 at him. The detectives also analyzed the psychology of the scene. If a woman is truly terrified for her life, her first instinct after a shooting is survival, calling for help, checking on her child, or fleeing the immediate area. Ashley's first instinct was the narrative. She didn't call 911 immediately. She waited. She composed herself. When the recording of her 911 call was analyzed by experts, they noted a haunting lack of physiological distress. No heavy breathing, no frantic pacing, no genuine shock. It was a performance that had started before the first shot was even fired. Her overconfidence was her undoing. Ashley seemed to believe that her status, a beautiful, young, white mother and former ballerina, provided an invisible suit of armor. She believed that in the state of Florida, the mere mention of domestic fear would be enough to shut the case. She had successfully manipulated Doug, her family, and even some local officials for years. Why would the detectives be any different? But the lead detective, a man who had seen 1,000 masks, saw through the tutu. He saw the cold calculation of a woman who had realized that a dead husband couldn't testify in a custody hearing. On November 4th, 2020, the armor finally shattered. Ashley was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The exposure of her plan sent shockwaves through the community. The Black Swan was no longer a nickname for her grace. It became a label for her nature, a rare predatory force that had hidden in plain sight. As the case moved toward trial, more details emerged from the digital shadows. Investigators recovered deleted messages and searched her browser history. They found a woman who wasn't researching how to escape abuse, but rather how to get away with, and custody laws in Florida. She had planned the move to Maryland not as a reconciliation, but as a trap. She had lured Doug into that house under the guise of a fresh start, knowing his devotion would make him an easy target. She had waited for her mother to leave. She had waited for the moment his back was turned. The damsel was gone. In her place sat a defendant who realized, perhaps for the first time, that she was no longer the director of this play. The state had the floor, the evidence was the script, and the ending she had so carefully choreographed was about to be rewritten by a jury of her peers. The prosecution's strategy was surgical. They didn't just attack her story, they dismantled her soul. They called it the Black Swan Murder Trial, a name that stuck because it perfectly captured the duality of the woman in the defendant's chair. State Attorney Suzanne O'Donnell presented the jury with a timeline not of a woman in fear, but of a woman in pursuit of total control. This case was never about domestic violence, the prosecution argued. This was about a woman who decided she didn't want a father for her child, and when the courts wouldn't give her what she wanted, she used a .45 caliber handgun to get it. The defense, led by a team that leaned heavily into the stand your ground narrative, attempted to paint Doug Benefield as a man with a hidden dark side. They brought up an incident where he had shot a gun into a ceiling during an argument years prior. They spoke of his intensity and his controlling nature. Ashley herself took the stand, a move that is always a gamble. On the witness stand, Ashley's performance was breathtaking. She wept at precisely the right moments. She spoke in a hushed, rhythmic tone, describing the night of the shooting as a blur of terror. She claimed Doug had boxed her in and that she saw a look in his eyes that told her she wasn't going to survive the night. It was a masterpiece of damsel in distress testimony. But then came the cross-examination. The prosecution didn't scream, they simply held up the photos. They showed the jury the images of the bedroom where Doug died. They pointed to the boxes he had been packing. They showed the ballistic trajectory of the bullets. The state's medical examiner testified with cold, scientific certainty. Doug Benefield was not lunging. He was not in an aggressive stance. The bullet in his leg had entered from the side. The fatal shot to his chest was consistent with a man who was falling or turning away. The physical reality of the room contradicted every word that came out of Ashley's mouth. The jury deliberated for 6.5 hours. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of legal pads. When they returned, the verdict was not the "not guilty" Ashley had clearly expected. While the jury didn't find the premeditation required for second-degree murder, they didn't buy the self-defense story either. The verdict: guilty of manslaughter. As the word was read, the mask finally slipped. For a fleeting second, the porcelain composure shattered, replaced by a look of sheer, cold disbelief. The woman who had spent years manipulating the legal system, the police, and the man who loved her had finally run out of moves. Under Florida law, a manslaughter conviction with a firearm carries a heavy penalty. The Black Swan was looking at up to 30 years in prison. In a dramatic final moment of the trial, Doug's eldest daughter, from his previous marriage, stood up to give a victim impact statement. She spoke not of a monster, but of a father who was flawed, deeply loving, and utterly undeserving of the execution his wife had choreographed for him. The judge, taking into account the calculated nature of the silver bullet strategy Ashley had employed, was not swayed by her tears. The damsel narrative had reached its final page. The lights were dimmed on Ashley Benefield's career as a victim, and the prison doors were prepared to close on a woman who had confused a marriage for a stage and a husband for an obstacle. The story of Ashley Benefield is a chilling reminder that the most sophisticated predators don't always wear a snarl. Sometimes they wear a tutu. It is a cautionary tale about the weaponization of the victim narrative, a warning that a society conditioned to protect the fragile must also be vigilant against those who use that fragility as a cloak for malice. Today, Doug Benefield is remembered by his friends and family not as the monster Ashley tried to create, but as a man whose greatest flaw was an unwavering belief in a woman who never truly existed. His daughter, the child at the center of this storm, grows up in the shadow of a legacy written in blood and betrayal. She is the true victim of this production, left to navigate a world where her father was erased by the very person who was supposed to teach her about love. As for the Black Swan, the spotlight has finally faded. The curtain has dropped on her carefully choreographed life, leaving her in the cold, unyielding reality of a prison cell. It serves as a final philosophical chord. The masks we wear can only hide the truth for so long. Eventually, the music stops, the lights come up, and we are forced to stand in the wreckage of the roles we chose to play. In the end, Ashley Benefield wasn't a victim of a man, but a victim of her own need for absolute control, a performance that cost a life and, ultimately, her own freedom. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. We are taught from a young age that the monsters are on the screen, that the shadows in the corner of the room vanish when we flip the switch. We find a strange comfort in the final girl of a horror movie, the one who survives the masked killer. But what happens when the final girl is the one holding the blade? What happens when a daughter decides that her mother isn't a protector, but a prop in a meticulously planned sequel? St. Clair, Sydney. A quiet night shattered, not by a scream, but by a knock on a neighbor's door. There stood Jessica, disheveled, calm, and holding a heavy, wet bundle. "I think I've killed my mother," she whispered. But she didn't just kill her. She had directed a masterpiece of carnage that even Hollywood would fear to film. Your likes and comments help promote our videos. And please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the monster, one must first look at the nursery. In the sun-drenched suburbs of Western Sydney, the Camilleri household appeared, by all accounts, to be a portrait of domestic endurance. Rita Camilleri was a woman of infinite patience, the kind of mother whose entire identity had been swallowed by the role of caretaker. And at the center of her world was Jessica. From the very beginning, Jessica was different. She didn't move through the world with the fluid social grace of her peers. Early on, she was diagnosed with a range of intellectual disabilities and autism spectrum disorder. To the outside world, she was a vulnerable young woman, fragile, perhaps a bit temperamental, but ultimately harmless. But behind the closed doors of their home, a much darker tapestry was being woven. As Jessica grew, her world began to shrink. The complexities of human interaction, the subtle cues of friendship, the nuances of empathy, remained locked boxes she couldn't open. So, she turned to a world she could control. A world where the rules were simple, even if they were soaked in blood. She found solace in the flickering blue light of the television. It started with a fascination that many teenagers share, a love for the macabre, the thrill of the jump scare. But for Jessica, it wasn't a hobby. It was a primary language. While other girls her age were dreaming of careers or romances, Jessica was building a shrine to the titans of the slasher genre, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Saw, Jeepers Creepers. These weren't just movies to her, they were instructional manuals. She became a connoisseur of the kill. She would sit for hours, rewinding the same scenes, her eyes reflected in the screen as she watched limbs being severed and lives being extinguished. She didn't just watch the gore, she studied it. She learned the sound a blade makes when it meets resistance. She learned the specific, rhythmic spray of an artery. To Jessica, there was a profound, twisted beauty in the total control a killer had over their victim. In the world of horror, the weak were silenced, and the powerful, the ones with the masks and the chainsaws, were the only ones who truly mattered. Rita watched this obsession grow with a mixture of concern and a desperate hope that it was just her way of coping. She bought the DVDs. She listened to Jessica recount the plots. She didn't realize she was fueling a fire that would eventually consume her. By her early 20s, Jessica's behavior began to take on a more sinister edge. The fragile daughter was developing a hair-trigger temper. She didn't just get angry, she became a force of nature. There were the phone calls, hundreds of them. Jessica would obsessively call strangers or acquaintances who had slighted her, screaming obscenities, threatening to cut off their heads. It was a specific recurring threat, a cinematic threat. The community saw a troubled girl. The medical professionals saw a complex case of behavioral issues linked to her neurodiversity. But no one truly saw the way Jessica was beginning to merge her reality with the scripts she memorized. She started to see herself as a protagonist in a world of villains, and in her mind, the person who exerted the most control over her, the person who tried to set boundaries, who tried to medicate her, who tried to keep her grounded in a reality she loathed, was her mother. Rita was the anchor. But to a woman who wanted to drift into a sea of red, an anchor is just a weight. Jessica's room became a fortress of plastic cases and posters of masked men. She had a collection, not of jewelry or shoes, but of horror films, over 500 of them. She would watch them on a loop, the dialogue sinking into her subconscious until she started to speak in the cadence of a movie villain. The social isolation was near total. She had no job, no real-world friends, no life outside the four walls of the house and the digital landscapes of cinematic slaughter. She began to demand more from Rita, more attention, more compliance. If a DVD didn't work, or if the internet was slow, the rage was volcanic. She would tear at her own hair, scream until her throat was raw, and directed that venom straight at the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. There is a specific kind of horror in the realization that your child is no longer yours. Rita lived in a state of perpetual high alert, a caregiver's fatigue that bordered on a survival instinct. She was walking on eggshells in a house filled with broken glass. She took Jessica to doctors. She sought help. But how do you explain to a psychiatrist that your daughter doesn't just like horror movies? She's starting to look at you like you're the first victim in an opening scene. The transformation was subtle, then sudden. The mask of care that the world saw, the image of a struggling disabled woman, was the perfect camouflage. No one suspects the girl who struggles to tie her shoes of being a calculated butcher. But inside, Jessica was waiting for her day X. She was waiting for the moment the credits would roll on her life as a submissive daughter and start on her life as a legend. The small details began to accumulate. The way she would linger in the kitchen, staring at the knife block. The way she would ask Rita questions about what happened to the body after death. The way she would mimic the cold, dead-eyed stare of Michael Myers in the hallway mirror. The domestic warmth of the Camilleri home was being replaced by an icy, calculated tension. The ordinary woman was gone. In her place was a woman who had spent years rehearsing for a role that was about to become terrifyingly real. The script was written. The cast was set. All Jessica needed was a spark to light the fuse. The bond between a mother and daughter is often described as a tether, unbreakable and profound. But for Rita and Jessica Camilleri, that tether had become a noose. By 2019, the dynamics within their home in St. Clair had devolved into a psychological pressure cooker. To understand why the cracks finally shattered the foundation of their lives, one must look at the exhausting circular nature of their relationship. Rita was not just a mother, she was a full-time guardian, a buffer between Jessica and a world that terrified and frustrated her. Rita's life was a series of negotiations. She negotiated Jessica's tantrums, her hygiene, her medications, and, increasingly, her escalating threats. Neighbors and extended family saw a woman who was perpetually tired, her face etched with the weariness of someone who had spent 25 years managing a storm that never broke. Jessica, meanwhile, existed in a state of arrested development, trapped between the cognitive abilities of a child and the physical strength of a woman. She possessed a deep-seated resentment toward her mother's authority. In Jessica's mind, Rita wasn't protecting her. Rita was a jailer. Every no, every reminder to take her pills, every attempt to curb her screen time was viewed as an act of war. The motive for what was to come wasn't born of a single moment of hate. It was a slow-growing cancer of entitlement and delusion. Jessica began to harbor a specific, toxic grievance. She believed her mother was evil. She convinced herself that Rita was controlling her through medicine and bullying her by demanding she live in reality. To a mind fueled by the logic of horror movies, the solution to a villain is simple. The villain must be eliminated. There was also the element of the Black Widow calculation, though not for financial gain. Jessica's calculation was emotional. She wanted total autonomy, the kind of freedom she saw in her favorite films, where the protagonist is answerable to no one. She began to talk about killing more frequently. It wasn't just "I hate you" anymore. It was "I'm going to cut your head off." Rita, perhaps blinded by a mother's hope, or perhaps simply paralyzed by fear, didn't flee. She did what many mothers of high-needs children do. She doubled down. She tried to love the violence out of Jessica. She even went so far as to pay a medium or exorcist thousands of dollars to rid Jessica of the demons she believed were possessing her. It was a desperate, final attempt to find a supernatural solution to a very human, very dangerous psychiatric problem. The cracks became chasms in the weeks leading up to July. Jessica's obsession with her horror collection reached a fever pitch. She wasn't just watching the movies. She was rehearsing them. She would stand in the kitchen, handling the knives, testing their weight. She would ask her sister, Christy, unsettling questions about whether you could live if your head was detached. She was checking the mechanics of her plan against the reality of human anatomy. There was a chilling incident involving a pet, a bird, that hinted at the escalating bloodlust. There were reports of Jessica being aggressive toward strangers in the street, fueled by a sense of perceived slight. The ordinary woman was slipping away, replaced by a persona that was cold, clinical, and increasingly emboldened. The motive was also shaped by a perverse desire for fame, or at least a desire to be as iconic as the characters she admired. Jessica didn't want a quiet life. She wanted a life that felt like a movie. She wanted the power to shock, the power to be feared, and the power to command the narrative. She began to view her mother not as a person, but as the victim required for her own origin story. By mid-July, the tension in the house was a physical presence. The air was thick with unsaid threats. Rita was exhausted, reportedly telling friends she was scared of her daughter. A rare admission for a woman who had spent decades defending her. The motive was now fully formed, an explosive mix of maternal resentment, a delusional need for self-defense against a non-existent threat, and a pathological drive to see if she could actually execute the gore she had watched 500 times on her bedroom wall. She began to wait for the right moment. Not an impulse, but a selection. She waited for a night when the world was quiet, when the neighbors were tucked away, and when the only sound in the house was the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. She was no longer just Jessica. She was the director, the star, and the executioner. The Black Widow was ready to bite, not for silk or gold, but for the visceral thrill of the kill. The plan was born from the Saw franchise, a game of life and death. Except Rita didn't know she was playing. She thought she was just making dinner. She thought she was safe in her home. She didn't realize that the girl she had tucked in for 25 years was now looking at her and seeing only a special effect waiting to happen. July 20th, 2019. In the suburbs of St. Clair, the winter air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows across the pavement of Richmond Crescent. Inside the Camilleri household, the atmosphere was thick, not with warmth, but with a suffocating electrical tension. This was the day the screen went black and the movie began. The evening started with a mundane domestic friction, the kind of trivial spark that, in any other house, would lead to a slammed door or a period of icy silence. But in Jessica's mind, the script had already been written. An argument broke out over something inconsequential. Reports suggest Rita had threatened to take Jessica to a psychiatric hospital, or perhaps she had simply reached her limit with Jessica's escalating verbal abuse. Whatever the trigger, the mask of care finally slipped from Jessica's face, revealing the cold, sharpened steel beneath. The kitchen, a place of nourishment and maternal care, became the kill floor. Jessica didn't reach for a single weapon. She reached for the tools of a trade she had studied for thousands of hours. She grabbed a knife, then another, and then another. As the first blade sunk into Rita's flesh, the reality of the act didn't horror Jessica. It seemed to energize her. The slasher wasn't a character anymore. It was her reflection in the stainless steel. What followed was not a quick struggle. It was a prolonged, ritualistic slaughter. Rita Camilleri, 57 years old, fought for her life against her own flesh and blood. She fought with the desperation of a mother who couldn't believe this was her end. But Jessica was relentless. She didn't just stab, she butchered. Over 100 stab wounds were later recorded. The sheer physical effort required for such an onslaught is staggering. The resistance of bone, the slickness of blood, the exhaustion of the muscles. Yet Jessica didn't tire. She was fueled by a pathological adrenaline, a manic focus that saw her switching knives when one became too blunt or broke under the force of the attack. The sounds in the house were a cacophony of terror, the rhythmic thud of the struggle, the gasping breaths of a dying woman, and the metallic clink of blades hitting the floor. Jessica later described the scene with a chilling, cinematic detachment. She spoke of the struggle as if she were a critic reviewing a particularly visceral scene in a film. Then came the climax of her obsession. Taking inspiration from the franchises that occupied her every waking thought, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Jeepers Creepers, Jessica decided that the mere death of her mother wasn't enough. She needed a trophy. She needed the definitive money shot of a horror masterpiece. With a clinical coldness that defies human comprehension, Jessica used her blades to decapitate her mother. She didn't stop until the head was completely severed from the body. But the movie wasn't over. The third act required an audience. Bathed in her mother's blood, Jessica did something that separates a simple murderer from a true monster. She picked up Rita's head. She walked through the house, past the photos of them together, past the DVDs and the posters of fictional killers, and opened the front door. She stepped out into the cool Sydney night. Imagine the silence of that street. The distant hum of traffic on the M4 motorway, the occasional bark of a dog, and then the sight of Jessica Camilleri walking down her driveway, carrying her mother's head like a macabre prop. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked to the neighbor's house and knocked. When no one answered, she moved to another. She eventually placed the head on the footpath, just outside a neighbor's fence, a grisly gift for the world to see. It was the ultimate jump scare in a life she had turned into a living nightmare. When the neighbors finally looked out, they didn't see a girl in need of help. They saw a figure standing in the shadows, covered in gore, gesturing toward a bundle on the ground. One neighbor would later testify to the sheer, surreal horror of realizing that the object on the concrete was not a mannequin or a sick joke, but the head of the woman who lived next door. Jessica's behavior in these minutes was characterized by a terrifying, lucid detachment. She wasn't screaming in grief. She wasn't in a state of catatonic shock. She was talking. She was explaining. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, they found her standing there, remarkably calm, given the carnage behind her. "I think I've killed my mother," she told them. But the phrasing was almost experimental, as if she were testing how the line sounded. The officers who entered the house were met with a scene that many would later require years of therapy to process. The kitchen was a sea of red. The ordinary items of a home, a kettle, a toaster, a fruit bowl, were splattered with the evidence of a frenzied execution. The sheer volume of blood was a testament to the ferocity of the attack. They found the broken knives, they found the body, and they found the daughter, who was now asking for her medicine and wondering if the doctors could sew her mother's head back on. This wasn't a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was a crime of production. Jessica had spent years consuming images of the impossible, and on this night, she had finally brought them into the three-dimensional world. The sensory details, the metallic smell of the blood, the silence of the neighborhood, the weight of the trophy in her hands, were the final pieces of a puzzle she had been building since childhood. The Day X ended not with a dramatic escape, but with the click of handcuffs and the flashing blue and red lights of the New South Wales police force. As she was led away, Jessica didn't look back at the house. She didn't look at the bundle on the sidewalk. She looked forward, into the cameras, into the flashbulbs, finally the center of a story that the whole world would be forced to watch. The final girl had become the slasher, and the credits were only just beginning to roll on the most horrific legal case in Sydney's recent history. The immediate aftermath of the slaughter was not a scene of frantic escape or desperate concealment. Instead, it was a display of chilling, surreal transparency. Jessica Camilleri did not wash the blood from her skin. She did not change her blue floral dress, now heavy and darkened with the lifeblood of the woman who had loved her most. Instead, she stepped into the role of a witness to her own horror. She walked out of the house on Richmond Crescent, carrying her mother's head in one hand and 2 mobile phones in the other. In her mind, the transition from the action to the aftermath followed a logic known only to her. a logic where the severed head was not a tragedy, but evidence. The silence of the neighborhood was shattered when Jessica approached a neighbor's door. Imagine the perspective of that neighbor. A quiet Saturday night, the television flickering in the living room, perhaps a cup of tea on the side table. Then, a knock. You open the door to find a young woman from down the street, drenched from head to toe in deep, visceral crimson. She is calm, she is coherent, and she is telling you something that the human brain is not wired to process. "I think I've killed my mother," she says. When the neighbor, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and instinctual terror, didn't immediately respond, Jessica moved on. She walked to the footpath outside another house. It was here that she dropped the head. Not once, but twice. It rolled onto the concrete, a grotesque punctuation mark to the evening's events. Jessica stood over it, waiting. She wasn't fleeing the scene. She was waiting for the first responders to arrive and validate the movie she had just completed. When the 000 call was placed, the operator was met with a voice that didn't sound like a woman in the throes of a psychotic break. Jessica spoke with a hauntingly matter-of-fact tone. She handed the phone to a confused neighbor, then took it back to explain that it was a life-or-death situation. She claimed her mother had tried to stab her, and that in self-defense, she had fought back. She used the vocabulary of a victim, but the details she provided were purely from the perspective of a butcher. "I took off her head," she told the operator. "I had my mother's head in my hand. I know this sounds insane." The first police officer to arrive, Senior Constable Anthony D'Agostino, found himself in a waking nightmare. His body cam caught the flickering blue and red lights reflecting off Jessica's blood-matted hair. She was holding a bottle of water and a phone. She wasn't aggressive toward the officers. She was inquisitive. Her questions, captured on tape, revealed the total dissolution of the boundary between her cinematic obsessions and the permanence of death. "Can you bring someone back to life if they don't have a head?" she asked, her voice tilting with a childlike curiosity. "Can you bring her back to life? Can the doctors do a miracle and sew her head back on?" When the officer, likely struggling to maintain his professional composure, told her that was a bit of a stretch, Jessica's concern shifted instantly. It wasn't grief for Rita that occupied her mind. It was her own survival. "I won't get the death penalty or anything, will I?" This is where the mask of care was replaced by the mask of the ego. Throughout the interaction, Jessica's focus remained entirely on herself. She complained that she couldn't move her fingers properly because of the incident. She fretted about being able to wash the blood off in the shower. She seemed to view the decapitation of her mother as a strenuous chore she had been forced to complete, rather than an act of ultimate depravity. The neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains and from the edges of their driveways as the police tape went up. The quiet street was now a forensic laboratory. The head lay on the concrete, under the harsh glare of flashlights, while the body remained in the kitchen, a scene so macabre that several of the responding officers would later require intensive psychological counseling. In those first few hours of custody, Jessica's behavior remained consistent with her slow burn transformation. She wasn't a weeping daughter, she was a storyteller. She began to weave a narrative of giving her mother a taste of her own medicine. She spoke of the struggle, of how half her nose fell off, and how she didn't think to put the head in a bag. She was looking for the replay button. She wanted to talk about the boom, boom, boom of the stabbing. She was, in her own mind, the star of a grisly new release, and the police were simply her first audience. The ordinary woman was gone for good. In the back of the police cruiser, as the lights of St. Clair faded behind her, Jessica Camilleri wasn't mourning. She was finally, terrifyingly, the center of attention. The detectives from the homicide squad were seasoned professionals, but the sheer clinical precision of the violence left them chilled. In the kitchen, they found a graveyard of kitchenware. 7 knives were recovered, many of them broken or bent, their handles slick with the evidence of Jessica's frantic exertion. But it was the discovery of Jessica's bedroom that provided the most damning exposure of her internal world. There, investigators found a sprawling library of the macabre. Over 500 DVDs were meticulously organized, a digital mausoleum of cinematic gore. They found posters and drawings that mirrored the very scene they had just processed in the kitchen. It became clear that this wasn't an explosion of rage, it was an imitation of art. Jessica hadn't just killed her mother, she had produced a scene from her favorite franchises. The exposure of her search history revealed a woman who had spent months researching human anatomy, focusing specifically on the neck and the difficulty of decapitation. When the formal police interviews began at the St. Mary's police station, the mask of the fragile daughter fell away entirely, replaced by a cold-blooded narrator. Jessica sat across from the detectives, her blue floral dress replaced by a gray forensic jumpsuit, and she began to talk. And talk. She didn't just confess, she critiqued her own performance. With a flat, monotone delivery that lacked any trace of maternal grief, she described the chore of the murder. She explained to the detectives how she had overkilled her mother because she wanted to make sure she was definitely gone. She spoke about the knives as if she were discussing a DIY project, complaining that some of them weren't sturdy enough for the task at hand. The detectives pushed her on the motive. She reverted to a script of self-defense, claiming that Rita had been the aggressor, but her story crumbled under the weight of her own pride. She couldn't help but brag about her strength. She told the officers with a hint of a smile that she had taken her head off. When asked why, she didn't offer a reason born of fear. She offered a reason born of a fanatical curiosity. She wanted to see if it would look like the movies. The investigation then turned to the cracks Rita had tried so hard to hide. Detectives spoke to family members and neighbors, uncovering a history of phantom calls and terrifying threats. They discovered that Jessica had made hundreds of anonymous phone calls to strangers, often using the same specific threat. "I'm going to cut your head off." It was a catchphrase she had been practicing for years. The most disturbing exposure, however, was the role of the medium. Investigators found that Rita had been so desperate, so terrified of the monster her daughter was becoming, that she had spent up to $2,500 on a woman who claimed she could perform an exorcism on Jessica. The tragedy was laid bare. Rita knew the danger was coming. She had felt the icy breath of the Black Widow on her neck for months, but instead of calling the police, she had called a mystic, hoping that love and faith could rewrite a script that was already being filmed. The forensic psychiatrists who entered the investigation faced a unique challenge. Jessica was clearly neurodivergent, but was she insane in the legal sense? The investigation revealed a woman who was acutely aware of the consequences. She had asked about the death penalty. She had asked if she could wash the blood off before the police arrived. She had even checked her own reflection in the mirror during the attack. This wasn't the behavior of someone who didn't know right from wrong. It was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was simply checking the special effects. As the days passed, the overconfidence that Jessica had displayed on the night of the crime began to work against her. She assumed that her diagnosis would be a get-out-of-jail-free card. She believed that because she had been bullied by her mother's rules, the world would sympathize with her rebellion. But the evidence, the 100 stab wounds, the severed head, the trophy on the sidewalk, told a different story. It told the story of a woman who had chosen her obsession over her humanity. The investigation ended not with a mystery solved, but with a terrifying portrait of a horror movie obsessive who had finally stopped watching and started doing. The exposure was complete. The world now knew that in a quiet house in St. Clair, the girl who loved the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had finally found her own Leatherface, and it was her. The legal battle that followed the horrors of Richmond Crescent was not a question of who, but a clinical dissection of a fractured mind. When Jessica Camilleri appeared in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, the public expected to see a monster. Instead, they saw a woman who seemed almost bored by the proceedings, a woman whose primary concern appeared to be when she could go home and resume her life. The trial, which unfolded in late 2020, became a battlefield for forensic psychiatrists. The central question: was Jessica a cold-blooded murderer who had finally acted out a lifelong fantasy, or was she a victim of her own biological wiring? The prosecution laid out a case of calculated ferocity. They pointed to the sheer logistics of the crime, the selection of multiple knives, the physical endurance required to decapitate a human being, and the deliberate act of carrying the head outside to show the neighbors. This wasn't a snap of the mind, they argued. It was a performance. They presented her obsession with horror films not as a passive hobby, but as a blueprint. Jessica's defense team painted a different portrait. They leaned heavily on her diagnoses: autism spectrum disorder, an intellectual disability, and a history of intermittent explosive disorder. They argued that Jessica didn't have the specific intent to murder, but rather had suffered a catastrophic meltdown fueled by a social and cognitive inability to process frustration. The jury was shown the police interview tapes. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as Jessica's voice filled the room, describing the struggle with the detachment of a person describing a trip to the grocery store. "I gave her a taste of her own medicine," she was heard saying. The lack of remorse was a physical presence in the room. There were no tears for Rita. There was only a persistent, nagging focus on her own discomfort and the annoyance of her mother's resistance. In December 2020, the jury reached a verdict that reflected the complexity of the case. They found Jessica not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter by way of substantial impairment. It was a special verdict, a recognition that while she knew what she was doing was wrong, her capacity to control herself was fundamentally broken. The sentencing hearing in 2021 was the final act of this tragedy. Justice Helen Wilson did not mince words. She described the crime as extraordinarily serious and a matter of great public horror. She spoke of the unimaginable terror Rita must have felt in her final moments, at the hands of the child she had spent her life protecting. Under the laws of New South Wales, Jessica was sentenced to a maximum of 21 years and 7 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 16 years and 2 months. But the climax didn't end with the banging of the gavel. In 2024, the case returned to the headlines as detention reviews and appeals regarding her mental health treatment within the correctional system were scrutinized. Even behind bars, Jessica remained a figure of intense debate. Was she a patient to be cured or a predator to be contained? Throughout the trial, Jessica's demeanor never shifted. She didn't look at her sister, Christy, who sat in the gallery, her life shattered. She didn't look at the photos of the mother she had butchered. She sat in the dock, sometimes fidgeting, sometimes staring into space, as if she were waiting for the boring parts of the movie to end so she could get to the credits. The truth that emerged in court was perhaps the most frightening of all. Jessica Camilleri wasn't insane in the way we like to imagine. She wasn't seeing demons or hearing voices from the beyond. She was simply a woman who had allowed the boundary between the fake blood of the screen and the real blood of the kitchen to vanish. She had become the star of her own slasher film, and the Australian legal system was left to pick up the pieces of a script that should never have been written. The screen eventually fades to black, but for those who lived through the nightmare of Richmond Crescent, there is no "the end" credit. Jessica Camilleri remains behind the high walls of a correctional center, a woman whose name has become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of the maternal bond. In the years since her sentencing, including the 2024 reviews of her mental state, the case serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the ordinary. We like to believe that evil is a distant shadow, something that belongs in the flickering world of a 90-minute movie. We tell ourselves that monsters are masked figures in the woods, not the daughters we feed, clothe, and protect. But the story of Jessica and Rita proves that the most terrifying horror isn't found in a fictional script. It's found in the silence of a suburban kitchen when the empathy of a human soul finally flickers out. Rita Camilleri died trying to save a daughter who had already replaced her with a character in a slasher film. Today, the house in St. Clair stands as a silent witness to the night the masks fell. It reminds us that while still waters run deep, sometimes what lies beneath the surface isn't just mystery, it's a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. In the end, Jessica got the iconic status she craved, but it came at the cost of the only person who truly saw her as human. The credits have rolled, the theater is empty, but the echoes of that July night continue to scream. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. They say that a woman's touch is meant to heal, to comfort, and to protect. We look for monsters in the shadows, never expecting to find them in the kitchen, pouring a third glass of cheap Chardonnay. But sometimes, the most dangerous predator is the one who claims to love you most, the one who hides a jagged edge behind a mask of domestic exhaustion. In the humid stillness of Winter Park, Florida, a simple game of hide-and-seek didn't end with a playful "found you." It ended with the cold, rhythmic pull of a zipper and a silence that would last forever. Sarah Boone didn't just kill the man she called her partner. She documented his final gasping breaths on her cell phone, convinced in her twisted heart that his slow suffocation was nothing more than a well-deserved lesson. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the woman who would eventually record a man's slow death with a smirk in her voice, one must first look at the sun-drenched, unremarkable streets of Florida, where the line between a quiet life and a desperate one often thins under the weight of humidity and isolation. Sarah Boone was not born a monster. To those who crossed her path in the earlier years of her life, she was simply Sarah, a woman who, like so many others, was searching for a sense of belonging in the sprawling suburbs of the Sunshine State. Born in 1977, Sarah grew up in a world that expected her to be the caregiver, the nurturer, the reliable daughter. There were no flashing red lights in her youth, no traumatic headlines that hinted at the darkness to come. She was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Floridian girl who seemed destined for the standard American trajectory: school, a career, perhaps a family of her own. She moved through her early 20s with the kind of anonymity that serves as the perfect camouflage for a burgeoning narcissism. To the outside world, she was fine, but beneath that fine exterior, a volatile mix of entitlement and a deep-seated need for control was beginning to simmer. By the time she reached her 30s, Sarah had settled into the role of a mother. This is where the mask of the ordinary woman was most firmly fixed. She lived in a modest home, dealt with the mundane stresses of parenting, and navigated the complexities of adult life. But the domestic bliss she projected was a fragile glass structure. Those who knew her more intimately began to see the cracks, the way her temper could flare over the smallest perceived slight, the way she used her perceived fragility as a weapon to garner sympathy or to deflect blame. In the eyes of her neighbors in Winter Park, she was just another face in the suburban landscape. They saw a woman who liked to enjoy her drinks, perhaps a bit too much as the years rolled on, but in a state where Florida man and Florida woman stories are the local currency, a little bit of erratic behavior is often overlooked. They didn't see the woman who, behind closed doors, was becoming increasingly obsessed with her own grievances. Sarah didn't see herself as a villain. She saw herself as a martyr. In her mind, she was a woman who did everything for everyone else, and yet was constantly wronged by the world. Her life was a series of temp jobs and shifting priorities. She wasn't a high-powered executive or a career-driven striver. She was someone who existed in the middle. She was the woman you'd pass in the grocery store aisle, perhaps looking a bit tired, perhaps a bit frazzled, but never someone you would suspect of being capable of calculated cruelty. This is the terrifying essence of the deadly woman, the ability to blend into the scenery of everyday life so perfectly that her evolution into a killer happens in plain sight, unnoticed. The transformation wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of empathy, fueled by a growing dependence on alcohol. Wine wasn't just a social lubricant for Sarah, it was the fuel for her internal fire. As the bottles emptied, the poor Sarah narrative grew stronger. She wasn't just a woman in a difficult relationship. She was a victim of a cruel universe. This self-victimization is the hallmark of the narcissistic perpetrator. It allows them to justify almost any action, no matter how heinous, because in their mind, they are simply leveling the playing field. By 2017, Sarah had met Jorge Torres Jr. On the surface, they were just another couple navigating the ups and downs of a long-term relationship. They shared a home in Winter Park, a quiet community just north of Orlando. But the walls of their apartment on Frisco Drive held secrets that the neighbors only heard in muffled shouts and the occasional slamming of a door. The ordinary Sarah was still there for the public, the woman who posted on social media, the woman who went to the store. But inside the home, a toxic dance was beginning. Sarah's childhood dreams of a perfect life had long since evaporated, replaced by a bitter reality she refused to take responsibility for. She began to view her life through a lens of extreme resentment. She wasn't the protagonist of a success story. She was the lead in a tragedy where everyone else was the antagonist. This shift in psychology is crucial. When a woman like Sarah stops seeing her partner as a person and starts seeing them as a symbol of all her failures, the path to violence is paved. She lived in a world of 1,200 square foot apartments and Florida heat, where the mundane can feel suffocating. Sarah wanted more. Not necessarily more money or more fame, but more power. She wanted to be the one who decided how things went. She wanted to be the one who held the keys. For years, she played the part of the supportive, if slightly troubled partner. She wore the floral prints, she kept the house, and she maintained the illusion of a woman who just wanted peace. But the peace Sarah wanted was the peace of total submission. As we look back at the years leading up to that fateful February night in 2020, we don't see a woman descending into madness. We see a woman honing her mask. We see a woman learning how to weaponize her voice, her tears, and her perceived weakness. The ordinary woman was a masterpiece of social engineering, designed to ensure that when the horror finally arrived, no one would believe she was the one holding the camera. The stage was set in Winter Park. The bottle was open. The suitcase was empty, waiting in the corner of the room like an omen. And Sarah Boone, the woman who just wanted to be understood, was about to show the world exactly who she was when the mask finally slipped. The relationship between Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. was not a romance. It was a battlefield of shifting alliances and mutual destruction. Jorge, a man described by those who knew him as generally soft-spoken but plagued by his own demons, became the primary canvas for Sarah's growing resentment. To the outside world, they were a couple that simply hit the bottle too hard, but within the four walls of their Florida apartment, a much more sinister dynamic was taking root. Sarah didn't just want a partner, she wanted a subject, someone she could mold, punish, and eventually dominate. Their history was punctuated by the frequent arrival of blue and red lights. Between 2017 and 2020, the Winter Park police were no strangers to the residents on Frisco Drive. Both Sarah and Jorge had been arrested for domestic violence against one another. In Sarah's mind, however, these weren't signs of a mutually toxic environment. No. In her narrative, she was the long-suffering heroine enduring the annoyance of a man who didn't know his place. She began to view Jorge not as a man she loved, but as a project that refused to be finished. The cracks in Sarah's psyche were filled with a potent mixture of Chardonnay and narcissism. As the alcohol flowed, her inhibitions dissolved, revealing a cold, calculating core. She began to keep a mental tally of every slight, every stupid thing Jorge said, every time he failed to live up to her impossible standards. This is the classic profile of the Black Widow in the making. Not one who kills for a life insurance policy, but one who kills to settle a psychological score. She didn't want him dead for money. She wanted him silenced for her own ego. Motherhood, for Sarah, had become a secondary role to her own drama. Her child was a witness to the escalating tension, a pawn in the power games she played with Jorge. Sarah's motives were not born from a sudden snap or a moment of blinding rage. They were the result of a slow, deliberate crystallization of hatred. She felt she was being cheated out of the life she deserved, and Jorge was the physical manifestation of that failure. If she couldn't have the life she wanted, she would at least have the satisfaction of being the one in control. In the months leading up to February 2020, the atmosphere in the home shifted from domestic warmth to an icy, predatory stillness. Sarah's aggression was no longer just verbal, it was becoming experimental. She was testing the boundaries of what she could get away with. She would belittle him, then film him in his moments of weakness, a digital collection of his humiliations that she kept like trophies on her phone. She was building a case against him, not for a court of law, but to justify the lesson she was preparing to teach him. The motive was deceptively simple. Sarah was bored, she was angry, and she felt superior. She viewed Jorge's dependence on her as a weakness to be exploited. In her twisted logic, putting him in that suitcase wasn't an act of murder. It was a fair response to his perceived transgressions. She wanted him to feel the weight of her power. She wanted him to understand, once and for all, that she was the director of this tragedy. The plan wasn't born in a dark alley. It was born in the glow of a television screen and the bottom of a wine glass. It was a game. That's how she would later describe it. But games imply a level playing field, and Sarah had ensured that the rules were entirely in her favor. She had spent years perfecting the role of the victimized woman, knowing that if she ever went too far, she could simply cry and point to her bruises, both real and imagined. She began to see Jorge's presence as an obstacle to her own peace. He was the noise in her head, the reminder of her mediocre life. The motive was the ultimate expression of narcissistic rage, the belief that another human being's life is a disposable price to pay for one's own emotional catharsis. Sarah didn't just want Jorge gone, she wanted him to know it was her who took him out. She wanted to watch the realization dawn on him. She was no longer just a wife or a girlfriend. She had ascended to the role of judge, jury, and executioner. As the sun set on February 23, 2020, the cracks had become a chasm. The domestic mask was still there, but it was brittle. Sarah had convinced herself that she was the one being persecuted, and that tonight, the roles would be reversed. She didn't need a gun, and she didn't need a knife. She had something much more personal, a large, blue, hard-shell suitcase, and a heart that had long since turned to ice. The motive was set, the victim was unsuspecting, and Sarah Boone was ready to play. The air in the Winter Park apartment was thick with the smell of cheap wine and the heavy, humid silence of a Florida night. It was February 23, 2020. To Jorge Torres Jr., it seemed like any other evening of blurred edges and hazy laughter. They had been drinking. Chardonnay for her, something stronger for him. They were celebrating, or so she said. They decided to play a game, hide and seek, a childhood pastime twisted into something macabre. Sarah suggested the suitcase, a large blue designer knockoff sitting in the middle of the floor like an open grave. "Get in," she likely urged, her voice a mix of playful flirtation and a jagged underlying command. And Jorge, perhaps wanting to please her, perhaps too intoxicated to see the predatory gleam in her eyes, complied. He climbed into the dark nylon void. He curled his 5'2" frame into a fetal position, trusting the woman who stood over him. Then, the sound. The sharp, mechanical zip, a jagged metallic scream that sliced through the quiet of the room. Sarah didn't just close it, she locked it. What followed was not a game. It was a descent into a singular, claustrophobic hell. At 11:12 p.m., Sarah pulled out her phone. She didn't call for help. She didn't realize the joke had gone too far. She pressed record. The video shows the suitcase lying on its side. It's bulging, twitching with the frantic movements of a man who suddenly realizes the air is running out. Sarah, I can't breathe, babe. Jorge's voice comes from the fabric, muffled, panicked, stripped of all dignity. Sarah's response is chillingly calm, punctuated by a small, cruel laugh. Yeah, that's what you do when you choke me, she retorts. She isn't a panicked girlfriend. She is a school teacher delivering a lecture to a dying student. You should probably shut up. She walks around the suitcase, the camera steady in her hand, capturing her own shadow as it dances over Jorge's tomb. He kicks. The suitcase rolls slightly. Sarah, I can't breathe. He gasps again, the sound of a man drowning in dry land. That's on you, she sneers. Oh, that's what I feel like when you cheat on me. She begins to mock him, her voice rising in a sing-song taunt. Phew, stupid! Every time he begs for his life, she throws a grievance back at him like a stone. This is her moment of ultimate clarity. She is finally the one in control. She is the one with the oxygen, and he is the one begging for a crumb of it. Minute after minute passes. The kicking slows, the frantic scratching against the interior lining, a sound like dry leaves in the wind, becomes rhythmic, then desperate, then weak. Sarah is unmoved. At one point, she pokes at the suitcase with her foot or perhaps a finger, watching the blue fabric react to his dying struggles. She is filming a snuff movie where she is the director, the star, and the sole audience member. Sarah! Sarah! He cries out one last time, his voice a thin thread of agony. I can't believe you're doing this, she says, her tone almost bored, as if his dying is a personal inconvenience to her. She records a second video. In this one, Jorge's hand is visible, a pale ghost trying to force its way through a tiny gap in the zipper. She doesn't help him. She doesn't unzip it an inch. She watches as the fingers retreat back into the darkness. Eventually, the movement stops. The game has reached its conclusion. The suitcase sits perfectly still under the harsh living room lights. There is no more gasping, no more pleading, just the hum of the refrigerator and the heavy breathing of a woman who feels she has finally won. Sarah Boone didn't stay up to mourn. She didn't panic and try to perform CPR. With the cold-bloodedness of a true sociopath, she put her phone down, walked to her bedroom, and went to sleep. She left Jorge Torres Jr. zipped inside that blue sarcophagus, his body heat slowly dissipating into the nylon, his lungs finally, mercifully, still. She slept for hours while her partner's body began the transition into a corpse, just a few feet away in the hallway. The lesson was over. The silence was absolute. The sun rose over Winter Park on February 24, 2020, casting a bright, unapologetic light into the apartment on Frisco Drive. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the metallic tang of dried sweat and the lingering scent of spilled wine. Sarah Boone awoke in her bed, emerging from a deep, alcohol-induced slumber. For a moment, it was a normal morning, until the reality of the blue suitcase in the hallway came rushing back. But Sarah didn't scream. She didn't rush to the suitcase with a knife to slash him free in a frantic hope that a spark of life remained. Instead, she began to craft her masterpiece, the role of the grieving partner. At approximately 1 p.m., nearly 14 hours after she had zipped the bag shut, Sarah finally placed a call to 911. Her voice on the recording is a study in calculated distress. It wasn't the guttural, incoherent wail of someone who had just found a loved one dead. It was a performance, a series of breathless gasps and carefully timed whimpers. "My boyfriend is dead," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile, but not enough to lose clarity. She explained the tragedy with a story that seemed designed for a sitcom, not a crime scene. They had been drinking, she said. They were playing. Jorge had willingly climbed into the suitcase. It was a joke, a light-hearted moment between two lovers. She claimed she had gone upstairs to bed, thinking he would just get out and follow her. She fell asleep, she insisted, only to wake up and find him still trapped, his body cold and unresponsive. When the first responders arrived, they found Sarah in a state of performative collapse. She was the picture of the distraught girlfriend, pacing, wringing her hands, and offering a stream of consciousness explanation that no one had asked for yet. She was devastated. She was confused. She played the part of the fragile woman so perfectly that for a brief window of time, the officers on the scene treated the apartment like a tragic accident site rather than a murder scene. Jorge's body was removed from the suitcase. The physical evidence of his struggle was harrowing. His fingernails were broken. His skin was bruised from his frantic attempts to push against the hard shell of his nylon prison. But Sarah stood by, her eyes wide with manufactured shock. She leaned into the officers, her body language screaming for comfort. She was the victim here, she implied. She was the one who had to live with this horrible accident. However, the detectives from the Orange County Sheriff's Office weren't looking at the script Sarah had written. They were looking at the details. They noticed the way the suitcase was positioned. They noticed that the zipper was not stuck, nor was it broken. Most importantly, they noticed Sarah's demeanor. There was an uncanny sharpness beneath her tears, a tendency to over-explain, to fill every silence with more proof of her innocence. She was too helpful, too eager to guide the narrative. "We were just having fun," she repeated, a phrase that would become her mantra. She spoke about their relationship as if it were a fairy tale momentarily interrupted by a fluke of physics. She portrayed Jorge as the one who suggested the game, painting herself as the passive participant who simply forgot her partner was suffocating in the hall. The first suspicions didn't come from a witness or a forensic lab. They came from the sheer impossibility of her story. A grown man, even a small one, does not simply forget to get out of a suitcase unless he is prevented from doing so. The detectives watched as she wiped away dry eyes and checked her reflection in the windows. The mask of the grieving wife was slipping, revealing the cold, narcissistic entitlement underneath. She expected them to believe her because she was Sarah Boone, a woman whose accidents were never her fault. But the most damning piece of evidence was sitting right there on the kitchen counter. Her cell phone. Sarah, in her supreme overconfidence, believed that she was the hero of her own story. She didn't think to delete the videos. Perhaps she even thought they would prove how drunk and playful they were being. She gave the officers permission to search the device, likely thinking her charm would distract them from the digital truth. As the detectives scrolled through her gallery, the grieving wife persona evaporated into the humid Florida air. They didn't find videos of a fun game. They found the recording of a slow, agonizing execution. They heard the laughter she had forgotten to mention. They heard the taunts. They saw the deadly woman in high definition, mocking a dying man's last breaths. The search efforts were over. The accident was a lie. And as the realization dawned on the investigators, the woman standing in the living room, the one who claimed to love Jorge Torres Jr., began to look less like a mourner and more like a predator who had finally been caught in her own trap. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered. and the silence that followed the discovery of those videos was far more chilling than any of Sarah's manufactured screams. The investigation into the death of Jorge Torres Jr. did not require high-tech forensic labs or a manhunt through the Florida Everglades. The evidence was held within a palm-sized device, surrendered by the perpetrator herself. In the interrogation room, the air conditioning hummed, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the Frisco Drive apartment. Detectives sat across from Sarah Boone, watching as she maintained her composure, her voice still pitched in that tone of weary, misunderstood innocence. The exposure began when the lead detective placed his phone on the table. He didn't lead with accusations. He led with her own words. He pressed play. The room was filled with the sound of the blue suitcase rustling. Then, the voice of the man she claimed to love, begging for his life. "I can't breathe." The detectives watched Sarah's face. There was no sudden outburst of grief, no horror at seeing the final moments of her partner. Instead, there was a calculated silence. She watched herself on the screen, watched as she taunted a dying man, and her first instinct wasn't remorse. It was defense. "That's not what it looks like," she stammered, the first real cracks appearing in her polished alibi. It was a lesson. He was always doing things to me. You don't know what I've been through." This was the core of Sarah Boone's undoing, her absolute, unshakable belief that she was the victim. Even when faced with video evidence of her own cruelty, she attempted to justify it. She argued that the videos were taken out of context, a phrase she would repeat like a prayer for the next 4 years. She claimed she didn't realize he was actually dying, despite the fact that his pleas for air were the only audible sounds in the recording besides her own mockery. Her alibi, the unfortunate accident born of a drunken game, crumbled under the weight of her own narcissism. She had been so confident in her ability to manipulate the narrative that she hadn't bothered to hide the murder weapon, the digital record of the crime. She assumed that the police would see her as she saw herself, a woman pushed to the edge by a difficult man, someone whose minor lapse in judgment resulted in a tragedy that was, ultimately, his own fault for getting into the bag. As the investigation deepened, the ordinary woman persona was stripped away to reveal a pattern of domestic volatility. Neighbors spoke of the constant shouting, police records showed the cycle of arrests. But it was Sarah's behavior after the arrest that truly exposed her. While awaiting trial, she didn't fade into the background. She became a nightmare for the Florida legal system. Driven by a sense of intellectual superiority, she went through a revolving door of legal representation. One by one, 8 different attorneys withdrew from her case. She accused them of incompetence, of being in cahoots with the prosecution, and of failing to understand the complexity of her situation. She wrote hundreds of pages of letters to the judge, filled with flowery language and legal jargon she clearly didn't understand, all in an attempt to delay the inevitable. She wasn't just fighting a murder charge. She was fighting to remain the center of attention. The prosecution built a case that was airtight, centered on those 2 haunting videos. They didn't need to prove she intended to kill him from the moment they started drinking. They only had to prove that she intentionally kept him in that suitcase while he begged for his life. The deadly woman had provided the state with a minute-by-minute confession. Her overconfidence was her greatest mistake. She believed she could outsmart the detectives, the judge, and eventually a jury of her peers. She viewed the courtroom not as a place of justice, but as a stage. But as the months turned into years, the world began to see Sarah Boone for what she was, a woman who had used a suitcase as a cage and a cell phone as a weapon. The investigation was over, the exposure was total, and the Black Widow of Winter Park was finally out of places to hide. The courtroom in Orange County, Florida, became the final theater for Sarah Boone's long-running performance. By October 2024, the suitcase murder had become a global sensation, not just because of the horror of the crime, but because of the woman standing at the center of it. For over 4 years, Sarah had manipulated the gears of justice, firing lawyer after lawyer, 8 in total, complaining that no one could properly represent her brilliance. When she finally stood before Judge Michael Cranick, the world saw a woman who hadn't been humbled by years in a cell, but one who had fermented in her own narcissism. The prosecution's case was a surgical strike. They didn't need long-winded theories. They had the digital ghost of Jorge Torres Jr. The courtroom went pitch black as the videos were projected onto a massive screen. The jury sat in a silence so heavy it felt physical, listening to the rhythmic, desperate thuds against the interior of the blue suitcase. They heard Jorge's fading voice. "I can't breathe, Sarah." And then they heard her. The laughter, the casual conversational tone as she mocked his slow suffocation. Sarah sat at the defense table, not with her head bowed in shame, but with the posture of a critic watching a film she found slightly flawed. She scribbled notes. She whispered to her 9th attorney. When it was finally her turn to take the stand, a move many legal experts deemed suicidal, she did so with an air of practiced victimhood. For hours, Sarah attempted to rewrite history. She didn't deny the suitcase. She didn't deny the recording. Instead, she introduced a new defense: battered spouse syndrome. She claimed that the years of abuse she suffered at Jorge's hands had put her in a state of self-defense. In Sarah's reality, zipping a man into a suitcase and watching him die wasn't murder. It was a preemptive strike. "I wanted him to understand," she told the court, her voice steady, devoid of the tremors one would expect from a woman discussing the death of a partner. She spoke about Jorge as if he were an object that had malfunctioned, a nuisance she had finally found a way to fix. She tried to use her vocabulary, words like intentionality and perspective, to create a fog of intellectualism around a brutal act of cruelty. She wasn't a killer, she argued. She was a woman who had simply gone to sleep and forgotten a detail. But the prosecutor, William J., was relentless. He didn't let her hide behind her flowery language. He played the videos again. He forced her to listen to Jorge's terror. "Does that sound like a woman who is afraid for her life?" he asked, the volume of Jorge's gasps filling the room. Sarah's mask finally began to crack, but not into remorse, into indignation. She was annoyed that the court wasn't seeing the truth as she saw it. She was the one who had suffered the most, she insisted. The fact that Jorge was dead was almost an afterthought to her own inconvenience. The jury took less than 90 minutes to reach a verdict. In the world of complex criminal trials, 90 minutes is an eternity of certainty. Guilty, second-degree murder. Sarah's reaction was a chilling display of her psychological makeup. There were no tears for Jorge. There was only a cold, hard stare directed at the jury, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She had failed to charm them. She had failed to outsmart the system. In December 2024, Sarah Boone returned to the courtroom for the final act, sentencing. Under Florida law, the judge had the discretion to give her a term of years or the ultimate price for her game. Judge Cranick did not mince words. He spoke of the extraordinary cruelty and the chilling lack of empathy documented by her own hand. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led her away, the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed like the final zip of that blue suitcase. Sarah Boone, the woman who thought she could control every narrative, was finally silenced by the very law she tried to manipulate. The deadly hide-and-seek had ended, and the woman who loved to watch her victims struggle was now destined to spend the rest of her life in a cage of her own making, a concrete box far more permanent than the one she had chosen for Jorge. The case of Sarah Boone remains a harrowing reminder that the most terrifying monsters don't always wear a snarl. Sometimes they wear a smirk and carry a glass of wine. In the end, the blue suitcase wasn't just a murder weapon. It was a mirror reflecting the absolute void of a woman who mistook cruelty for power and silence for victory. Sarah believed she was teaching a lesson, but the world learned a much darker one, that a woman's touch can be as cold as a metallic zipper, and that some masks of domesticity are never meant to be removed. Jorge Torres Jr. lost his life in a few square feet of nylon, while Sarah lost her soul in the minutes she spent recording his struggle. Today, she sits in a Florida prison, a place where the walls are thick and the doors are always locked. There are no games there, and there is no one left to manipulate. She is finally exactly where she put Jorge, in a space where no matter how loud she screams, no one is coming to let her out. It's the ultimate irony of her narcissistic design. The woman who wanted the final word is now left with nothing but the echoes of her own taunts, playing on a loop in the silence of her cell. We like to think we know the people we love, but as Sarah Boone proved, sometimes the person smiling across the dinner table is just waiting for the right moment to see if you'll fit inside the box they've built for you. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. They say a daughter is a mother's reflection, a softened mirror of the woman who gave her life. But sometimes, in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Aurora, Colorado, that mirror doesn't just crack. It shatters into 1,000 jagged pieces. We are instinctively drawn to the faces of evil, but we are captivated when those faces are young, delicate, and hauntingly beautiful. In the digital age, a single look can turn a perpetrator into a cult icon. A playful tilt of the head, a coy smirk directed at a news camera, a girl casually fixing her hair in a courtroom as if she were prepping for a prom photo, while the blood of her own mother was barely dry on the bathroom floor. It was the smile that conquered TikTok, but behind the pixels lies a story of 79 wounds and a scream that went unanswered. This is the chilling reality of Isabella Guzman, the girl who proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't a knife, it's the mask of innocence. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the summer of 2013, one must first look past the viral courtroom clips and the haunting, playful expressions of an 18-year-old girl. We must look into the quiet corners of a life that, on the surface, mirrored the American dream of many immigrant families. Isabella Guzman was not born a monster. She was a girl born into the expectation of normalcy, raised in a world where the boundaries between teenage rebellion and psychological collapse were dangerously blurred. Isabella grew up in the suburbs of Aurora, Colorado, a place defined by its vast rolling plains and the quiet safety of its residential streets. Her mother, Yoon-mi Hoi, had come from South Korea, seeking the stability and opportunity that the United States promised. Yoon-mi was a woman of discipline, a woman who understood the value of hard work and the importance of family structure. She was, by all accounts, a devoted mother, perhaps protective to a fault, but driven by a deep-seated love for her only daughter. In the early years, the bond between mother and daughter seemed unbreakable. Photos from Isabella's childhood show a bright-eyed girl with a wide, genuine smile, long before that smile became a source of international fascination. She was the light of Yoon-mi's life. Neighbors remembered a polite girl, a student who moved through the world with a certain grace. There was no outward sign of the darkness that would later consume her. No history of cruelty to animals, no pyromania, none of the traditional red flags that criminologists often look for in the histories of violent offenders. But as Isabella entered her teenage years, the mask of the dutiful daughter began to slip. It started subtly, small fissures in the foundation of their relationship. The transition from childhood to adolescence is often a battlefield, but in the Guzman Hoi household, the skirmishes were becoming increasingly volatile. Isabella was becoming a young woman, and with that growth came a fierce, almost desperate desire for autonomy, a desire that frequently clashed with Yunmi's more traditional, structured parenting style. By 18, Isabella was a striking young woman. She possessed a delicate, almost doll-like beauty that commanded attention. But behind those dark eyes, a transformation was taking place. The ordinary girl was being replaced by someone unpredictable, someone who viewed the world through a lens of perceived persecution. The typical grievances of a teenager, curfews, chores, the choice of friends, were no longer just points of contention. They were becoming triggers for an explosive internal rage. Those who knew her in high school described a girl who could be charming and magnetic one moment, and cold and distant the next. She was a girl of moods, shadows that would pass over her face like storm clouds on a summer afternoon. Yet, in the social hierarchy of suburban Colorado, she remained relatively unremarkable to the outside world. She wasn't the outcast. She wasn't the troubled kid in the back of the class. She was simply Isabella, the girl next door who seemed to be going through a particularly difficult rebellious phase. However, inside the walls of the family home on South Lima Street, the atmosphere was thickening with a palpable sense of dread. The domestic warmth was being replaced by an icy, suffocating tension. Isabella's stepfather, Ryan Hoy, began to notice a shift that went beyond teenage angst. There was a coldness in Isabella's gaze, a way she would look at her mother that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't the look of a frustrated child. It was the look of a stranger watching an enemy. The psychology of a female perpetrator often involves a period of simmering, a long, slow burn of resentment that remains hidden from the public eye. Isabella was perfecting the art of the dual identity. To her peers, she was just another girl on the cusp of adulthood. To her mother, she was becoming a source of constant, low-level anxiety. Yunmi, ever the caregiver, tried to bridge the gap. She tried to enforce rules not out of a desire for control, but out of a desperate hope to steer her daughter back toward the right path. She didn't realize that every rule she enforced was being logged in Isabella's mind as a personal affront, a brick in the wall of a silent, growing vendetta. The dream of a stable, happy life in Aurora was evaporating. Isabella began to withdraw further into her own world, a world where her mother was no longer a provider, but an obstacle. The ordinary woman image was a thinning veil. As she walked the halls of her school or navigated the aisles of local shops, no one could have guessed that this 18-year-old was standing on the precipice of a mental and moral abyss. There were no sirens, no warning lights. There was only the quiet ticking of a clock in a suburban kitchen and a young woman who was beginning to see blood where others saw love. By the late summer of 2013, the transformation was nearly complete. The girl who once played with dolls was now obsessed with the power she could exert over those who wronged her. The motive wasn't money, and it wasn't a sudden burst of passion. It was the cold, calculated conclusion of a mind that had decided the person who gave her life was the only thing standing in the way of her freedom. The still waters of Isabella Guzman's personality were about to reveal the monsters lurking beneath the surface, and the town of Aurora would never look at a teenage smile the same way again. The architecture of a family is often built on unspoken agreements, but by August 2013, the foundation of the Hoy household was crumbling into dust. To understand why an 18-year-old girl would turn a blade upon the woman who birthed her, we must examine the cracks in their bond, cracks that were widening into chasms. This wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of the maternal connection. In the realm of female criminality, the home is frequently the primary theater of war, and for Isabella Guzman, her mother, Yunmi, had become the ultimate adversary. The relationship between Yunmi and Isabella had devolved into a toxic cycle of surveillance and defiance. Yunmi, perhaps sensing a darkness she couldn't quite name, attempted to tighten her grip. She worried about the company Isabella kept, the late hours, and the growing lack of respect that radiated from her daughter like a physical heat. But in the mind of a girl spiraling into a fractured reality, this motherly concern was interpreted as a declaration of war. Isabella didn't see a mother trying to save her, she saw a jailer. It is here that the psychological profile of the Black Widow, or the femme fatale, takes a different, more domestic shape. Isabella wasn't seeking financial gain or a lover's approval. Her motive was rooted in a distorted sense of entitlement and a deep-seated rejection of authority. She began to exhibit a chilling lack of empathy, a hallmark of those who hide aggression behind a facade of youth and fragility. While she appeared to be a delicate teenager to the world at home, she was becoming a predator in a sundress. The tension reached a boiling point in the days leading up to the tragedy. The arguments were no longer about messy rooms or missed curfews. They were visceral, screaming matches that left the house trembling. It was during one of these confrontations that Isabella took a step that shifted the narrative from domestic strife to premeditated intent. She didn't just scream, she documented her rage. She sent an email to her mother, a digital omen that would later haunt the investigators. The words were short, punchy, and devoid of any daughterly affection. "You will pay." Those 3 words transformed a family dispute into a countdown. Yunmi was terrified. For the first time, the mother who had always tried to fix things realized she was in danger. She did what any terrified parent would do. She reached out for help. She called the police, not to have her daughter arrested, but to have her cautioned. She hoped that a badge and a uniform might snap Isabella back into reality. When the officers arrived at the South Lima Street home, they found a young woman who was eerily calm. Isabella looked the officers in the eye, her voice steady, her demeanor that of a misunderstood victim. The officers, seeing no immediate signs of physical violence, could do little more than offer words of advice. They left, unaware that they had just witnessed a masterclass in manipulation. Isabella's stepfather, Ryan Hoy, was the silent witness to this escalating madness. He saw the way Isabella would stare at the back of her mother's head, a cold, unblinking gaze that suggested she was measuring a distance or calculating a strike. He tried to intervene, to act as a buffer between the 2 women, but he was increasingly sidelined. The bond between Isabella and Yunmi had become a closed circuit of resentment, and Ryan was merely a spectator to the flickering lights of their dying relationship. The plan wasn't born from a single moment of clarity. It grew like a parasite. Isabella began to obsess over the perceived wrongs her mother had committed. In her mind, Yunmi was the source of all her frustrations, the barrier to a life of absolute freedom. Whether this was fueled by a burgeoning mental illness or a calculated cold-blooded decision to eliminate an obstacle remains a point of intense debate. What is clear, however, is that Isabella began to distance herself from the role of the daughter. She was no longer Isabella, she was an agent of retribution. On the afternoon of August 28, 2013, a strange incident occurred that served as a final warning. While Yunmi was at work, Isabella allegedly spat in her mother's face during a brief encounter. It was an act of supreme disrespect, a physical manifestation of the "you will pay" promise. Later that day, Yunmi's fear had become so acute that she called her ex-husband, Isabella's biological father, Robert Guzman. She begged him to talk to their daughter, to calm the storm that seemed to be brewing behind Isabella's eyes. Robert came over. He sat with Isabella on the back porch, the Colorado sun setting over the suburban fence. He spoke to her about respect, about the love a mother has for her child, and for a moment, he thought he had reached her. Isabella listened. She nodded. She played the part of the repentant teenager to perfection. He left that evening believing the crisis had been averted. He believed that the mask was the true face. But as the front door clicked shut and the house grew quiet, the air inside 2624 South Lima Street didn't feel lighter. It felt charged. The domestic warmth that Yunmi had worked so hard to maintain was now a suffocating shroud. The cracks were no longer just visible. The entire structure was leaning. Inside her bedroom, Isabella wasn't thinking about her father's advice or her mother's love. She was listening to the sounds of her mother returning home from work, the sound of the shower being turned on, the mundane noises of a woman who thought the danger had passed. Isabella wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't a victim of her circumstances. She was a woman who had weighed the life of her mother against her own temporary frustrations and found the life wanting. The Black Widow typically kills for insurance money. The femme fatale kills for passion. Isabella Guzman was something more modern and perhaps more terrifying. She was a killer who acted out of a cold, narcissistic need to delete anyone who challenged her will. The ordinary girl was gone. In her place stood someone who had already decided that tonight, the debt would be settled in full. The evening of August 28, 2013, began with the deceptive rhythm of a typical suburban Wednesday. In Aurora, the air was cooling as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, casting long, bruised shadows across South Lima Street. Inside house number 2624, the mundane sounds of domesticity played out. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of a television, the heavy footsteps of a man trying to find peace in a home filled with invisible landmines. Ryan Hoy sat downstairs, perhaps allowing himself a moment of cautious optimism. His stepdaughter had spoken with her biological father. The "you will pay" email was, he hoped, just the hysterical hyperbole of a troubled teen. But in the silence of the upper floor, Isabella Guzman was preparing to prove that her words were not a threat. They were a prophecy. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Yunmi Hoy returned home from a long shift. She was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from carrying the weight of a fractured family. She exchanged a few words with Ryan, nothing memorable, just the low-stakes chatter of a weary couple. She then headed upstairs. She wanted nothing more than the cleansing heat of a shower to wash away the stress of the day and the lingering dread of her daughter's recent outbursts. She entered the bathroom, closed the door, and turned on the water. Downstairs, Ryan heard the pipes groan, a familiar, comforting sound. But then, the rhythm of the house was shattered. It started with a thud, then a muffled cry. Ryan's heart hammered against his ribs as the sounds escalated into a frantic, wet drumming against the bathroom floor. He sprinted up the stairs, his lungs burning. He reached the bathroom door and turned the knob. It was locked. From inside, the sound of the shower continued to hiss, a rhythmic backdrop to a scene of mounting carnage. He pounded on the wood, his voice cracking as he screamed Yunmi's name. "Isabella! Open the door! Let me in!" There was no verbal response. Instead, he saw a dark, viscous liquid beginning to seep from under the doorframe, staining the hallway carpet. It was blood. It moved with a terrifying speed, a silent tide of red. Ryan threw his shoulder against the door, once, twice. The wood groaned, but the lock held. Through the narrow gap beneath the door, he caught a glimpse of Isabella's feet. She was standing still. Inside that small, steam-filled room, the ordinary girl had vanished, replaced by a whirlwind of clinical, repetitive violence. Isabella didn't just strike. She decimated. She had armed herself with a knife, and as her mother stood vulnerable and naked in the shower, Isabella had lunged. The first strike was likely a shock, a sharp, cold intrusion into the warmth of the water. But it was followed by another, and another. The autopsy would later tell the gruesome story that Ryan could only hear through the door. Isabella was not merely killing, she was erasing. She targeted her mother's face and neck with a terrifying, obsessive precision. 31 stab wounds to the face, 7 to the neck. The rest were scattered across Yunmi's torso and arms as she desperately tried to shield herself from her own child. The sounds Ryan heard were the sounds of a struggle for life that was being systematically extinguished. Ryan ran to the phone, his fingers slick with sweat as he dialed 911. His voice, captured on the emergency recording, is a portrait of pure, unadulterated panic. He told the dispatcher his daughter was killing his wife. He begged for help. He returned to the door, desperate, and this time, the door finally opened. The steam billowed out into the hallway, carrying with it the metallic tang of blood and the scent of cheap soap. Isabella stepped out. She didn't look like a girl who had just committed a crime of passion. She didn't look panicked. She looked transformed. She was draped in a cloak of icy detachment. In her hand, she held the knife. She didn't say a word to Ryan. She didn't scream. She simply walked past him, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance that only she could see. Ryan rushed into the bathroom, but the sight that greeted him was beyond the capacity of the human mind to process. Yunmi was slumped against the wall of the tub, the water still running, turning the pool at her feet into a pale pink swirl. Her face, the face that had looked at Isabella with love for 18 years, was unrecognizable. The sheer volume of the wounds suggested a ritualistic level of rage. It wasn't an act of murder, it was an act of mutilation. While Ryan desperately tried to find a pulse that wasn't there, Isabella was moving through the house with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. She didn't flee immediately. She went to her room. She changed her clothes. She washed the worst of the gore from her skin, though the scent of it likely clung to her hair. She was a black widow who had finished her web, and now it was time to leave the carcass behind. She slipped out of the house into the cool Colorado night. As the first sirens began to wail in the distance, the sound Yunmi had hoped would save her just hours earlier, Isabella disappeared into the shadows of the suburban streets. She left behind a husband shattered, a home turned into a slaughterhouse, and a mother who had paid the ultimate price for a daughter's perceived grievances. The sensory details of that night are what haunt the investigators to this day. The sound of the water running for minutes after the heart had stopped. The sight of the "you will pay" email still sitting in an inbox downstairs. And the image of Isabella walking out of that bathroom with the calm of a person who had just finished a mundane chore. In the world of true crime, we often look for the why. We look for the breaking point. But as the clock struck 10 p.m. in Aurora, there was no why that could satisfy the horror. There was only the how. 79 thrusts of a blade, a locked door, and a daughter who had decided that her mother's life was a debt that could only be settled in blood. The still waters had finally overflowed, and the resulting flood had washed away everything that Isabella Guzman used to be. She was no longer a student, a daughter, or a neighbor. She was a fugitive, wandering through the night with the blood of her mother metaphorically and literally under her fingernails. The hunt was on. But even as the police swarmed South Lima Street, they had no idea that the girl they were looking for wasn't hiding in fear. She was preparing for her next act, the act that would eventually make her the most infamous face on the internet. The day X of the murder was over, but the day X of Isabella's public persona was just beginning. The aftermath of a storm is often quieter than the gale itself, and in the wake of the carnage on South Lima Street, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the neighborhood. As the blue and red lights of the Aurora Police Department pulsed against the siding of the Hoy residence, the primary question wasn't just why, but where. Isabella Guzman had stepped out of that blood-slicked bathroom and vanished into the Colorado night, leaving behind a trail of crimson footprints that stopped abruptly at the edge of the property. She had no car, no money, and no clear destination, yet she had slipped away with the grace of a phantom. The manhunt began in earnest before the clock struck midnight. Officers fanned out across the suburban grid, their flashlights cutting through the darkness of parks and backyards. They were looking for an 18-year-old girl in a pink sports bra and turquoise shorts, the outfit Ryan Hoy had described through his tears. But Isabella was already ahead of them. In the mind of a predator, the first few hours after a strike are defined by a singular, primal drive: survival. She didn't head for the highways or the bus stations. She stayed close, moving through the shadows of a world she had known her entire life, now seeing it through the eyes of a killer. For 15 hours, Isabella Guzman was the most wanted woman in Colorado. The police issued a critical alert, describing her as armed and extremely dangerous. The community was on edge. Neighbors locked their doors and peered through their blinds, terrified that the doll-faced girl from down the street might be crouching in their crawl spaces. There was a surreal quality to the search. This wasn't a hardened convict or a career criminal. This was a girl who, just days prior, was likely scrolling through social media like any other teenager. The contrast between her delicate appearance and the sheer brutality of the 79 stab wounds created a sense of cognitive dissonance that the public struggled to process. While the police searched, the first suspicions began to solidify into a terrifying profile. Detectives interviewed Ryan Hoy and Isabella's biological father, Robert. The pieces of the puzzle started to click into place: the "you will pay" email, the spitting incident, the volatile mood swings. This wasn't a girl who had snapped in a moment of temporary insanity. This was a crescendo. The mask of the ordinary daughter had been discarded in that bathroom, and what remained was something cold and unrecognizable. Then came the first sighting. Early the next afternoon, a report came in from a nearby parking garage on South Parker Road, less than a mile from the crime scene. A witness had spotted a young woman who looked remarkably like the girl on the news. She was sitting in a car that didn't belong to her hair matted, her expression blank. When the police arrived, they found Isabella. She wasn't running. She wasn't fighting. She was simply there. The capture was almost anticlimactic. As officers approached with weapons drawn, Isabella didn't reach for a knife or scream for mercy. She moved with a strange, liquid lethality, slow and deliberate. She was taken into custody without incident, but the girl who entered the back of the patrol car was not the same girl who had been lived in that house for years. She was a hollowed-out version of herself, or perhaps, for the first time, she was her true self. At the station, the mask of the innocent girl attempted a final, desperate performance. In those initial hours of interrogation, there was no confession. There were no tears for Yunmi. Instead, there was a chilling disconnect. Isabella acted as though she were a spectator to her own life. When investigators presented her with the reality of what had happened, the state of the bathroom, the number of wounds, the testimony of her stepfather, she didn't recoil in horror. She watched them with a curiosity that was deeply unsettling. The first suspicions of the detectives were that they were dealing with a sociopath, a black widow in the making who had simply skipped the marriage phase and gone straight to matricide. But as the hours turned into days, a different theory began to emerge. Isabella's behavior wasn't just cold, it was bizarre. She would stare at the walls for hours, then suddenly break into a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. She would fix her hair in the reflection of the interrogation room glass, preening as if she were waiting for a stage cue rather than a murder charge. The public, however, saw something different. When the first mugshot was released, the world was introduced to a girl who looked more like a catalog model than a murderer. Her features were symmetrical, her skin clear, her gaze intense. The fragility that the deadly woman archetype often uses to hide aggression was on full display. People began to wonder, how could something so beautiful do something so hideous? It was during this period of initial detention that the first seeds of her viral fame were planted. Isabella wasn't just a suspect, she was a visual enigma. She began to play to the audience of guards and lawyers, honing the facial expressions that would later captivate millions. The grief of a daughter who had lost her mother was entirely absent, replaced by a performative, eerie vanity. She seemed more concerned with how she appeared to the camera than the fact that she was facing a life sentence. The search efforts were over, and the investigation was shifting from who to what. What was Isabella Guzman? Was she a cold-blooded killer who had meticulously planned the removal of her mother? Or was she a broken vessel, a girl whose mind had shattered under the weight of a burgeoning psychosis? As the detectives built their case, the shadow of the "you will pay" email loomed large. It suggested premeditation, a cold calculation that clashed with the image of a confused, mentally ill teenager. The town of Aurora tried to return to normal, but the air remained thick with the memory of that night. The still waters had broken, and the girl who had conquered the digital world with a smile was now locked behind steel bars, waiting for her day in court. The mask was being polished, the world was watching, and Isabella Guzman was ready for her close-up. The wheels of American justice are often slow, but in the case of Isabella Guzman, they were grinding against a psychological enigma that the state of Colorado was ill-prepared to handle. As the 18-year-old sat in a stark jail cell, a team of forensic experts and detectives began the painstaking process of dismantling her life, looking for the exposure that would explain the inexplicable. They weren't just looking for physical evidence. They were looking for the moment the ordinary girl became the Black Widow of her own household. The physical evidence was, quite frankly, overwhelming. The bathroom on South Lima Street was a forensic nightmare. Detectives recovered the murder weapon, a kitchen knife that had been used with such ferocity that the blade was nearly exhausted by the end of the assault. Blood spatter analysis told a harrowing story of a struggle that moved from the shower to the floor, confirming that Yunmi Hoi had fought for every breath. There was no question of who had held the knife. Isabella's DNA was intermingled with her mother's in a visceral biological bond that no defense lawyer could argue away. But the investigation soon pivoted from the how to the state of mind. This is where the case began to veer into the surreal. As detectives combed through Isabella's digital footprint, the "you will pay" email stood out like a red flare in a dark sky. To the prosecution, this was the smoking gun of premeditation. It wasn't an impulse, it wasn't a sudden break. It was a threat, followed by execution. They saw a cold, calculating young woman who had grown tired of her mother's rules and decided to delete the problem. However, as psychologists began their court-ordered evaluations, the portrait of Isabella started to fracture. The exposure wasn't just about a crime. It was about a mind in total collapse. Doctors observed her in her cell. She wasn't acting like a typical inmate facing a life sentence. She was seen staring into corners, talking to people who wasn't there, and exhibiting a flat affect, a psychological term for a total lack of emotional resonance. She didn't seem to understand that her mother was dead, or if she did, the information carried the same weight as a weather report. The overconfidence that often leads to a criminal's exposure was present in Isabella, but it was tinted with a strange, manic hue. She seemed to believe she was untouchable, not because she was a master criminal, but because she was no longer living in the same reality as the rest of society. The detectives discovered that in the weeks leading up to the murder, Isabella's behavior had become increasingly erratic. She told friends she was hearing voices. She claimed her mother wasn't actually her mother, but an imposter, a symptom known in clinical circles as Capgras delusion. Isabella's alibi, or lack thereof, crumbled not because she was sloppy, but because she seemed to have forgotten she needed one. She had walked out of the house, left the weapon, and simply waited in a parking garage. To a seasoned detective, this was either the sign of a genius-level sociopath who knew she would be caught and didn't care, or a girl who was profoundly elsewhere. The overconfidence wasn't rooted in a belief that she wouldn't be caught. It was rooted in the belief that the rules of the world no longer applied to her. The exposure reached a fever pitch when the results of the psychological testing came back. The diagnosis was devastating: paranoid schizophrenia. The doctors argued that Isabella wasn't a Black Widow in the traditional sense. someone who kills for gain or spite. Instead, she was a girl who believed she was saving the world from a monster. In her fractured mind, the woman in the bathroom wasn't Yunmi, she was a demon that needed to be exorcised. This revelation threw the prosecution into a tailspin. How do you try a girl for 79 stabs when she claims she was fighting a war against the supernatural? Yet the mask remained. Even as her defense team prepared for an insanity plea, Isabella continued to perform. She was hyper-aware of the presence of others. When she knew she was being watched, she would adjust her posture, tilt her head, and offer that chilling, doll-like stare. It was as if she were a character in a movie that only she was watching. The exposure of her mental illness didn't make her less terrifying to the public. It made her more so. It suggested that behind her beautiful face, there was an absolute void where a conscience should be. The investigation also looked into her childhood, searching for the trauma that triggers such a violent break. They found a girl who had struggled with her identity, a girl who felt caught between the traditional Korean values of her mother and the fast-paced, individualistic culture of American youth. But thousands of teenagers feel that way. Very few of them pick up a knife. The mistakes she made were human, but the motive remained elusive. Was it the disease, or was the disease a convenient shield for a girl who simply wanted her way? By the time the trial date approached, the evidence was a mountain of contradictions. You had the cold, hard facts, the email, the knife, the 79 wounds, and you had the clinical assessments, the delusions, the voices, the fractured psyche. The exposure of Isabella Guzman was the exposure of a tragedy with no easy villains. If she was a monster, she was a monster born of biological misfortune. If she was a killer, she was the most cold-blooded teenager Colorado had ever seen. As the legal teams prepared their opening statements, the girl in the cell continued to fix her hair in the reflection of the stainless steel toilet. She was ready for her audience. The investigation was over, the forensic maps were drawn, and the truth, whatever version of it Isabella chose to believe, was about to be broadcast to the world. The girl who would pay her mother back in blood was about to become a household name, proving that sometimes the most terrifying thing a detective can expose is the fact that we can never truly know what is happening behind a beautiful pair of eyes. The courtroom of the 18th Judicial District in Centennial, Colorado, is a place of sterile, hushed formality, designed to strip away the sensationalism of the outside world. But in late 2013, it became the stage for a performance that would eventually burn through the internet like a wildfire. This was the climax of a domestic horror story, the moment when the town of Aurora, and eventually the world, would look into the eyes of Isabella Guzman and try to find a trace of a soul. Isabella did not enter the courtroom like a typical defendant. There was no bowed head, no tearful glances toward her surviving family. Instead, as the cameras from the local news pool began to whir, Isabella found her lens. She didn't just look at the cameras, she played to them. She tilted her head with a coy, doll-like curiosity. She puffed out her cheeks, made playful fish faces, and used her shackled hands to push back strands of hair with the grace of a debutante. The disconnect was jarring. On the monitors in the courtroom, the prosecution was preparing to show the visceral reality of what had happened in that bathroom. The 79 wounds, the blood-soaked carpet, the "you will pay" email. And in the center of it all sat the girl who had done it, smirking as if she were in on a private joke that the rest of the room was too dull to understand. It was this footage, years later, that would find a second life on TikTok and YouTube, set to haunting music, turning a matricide into a vibe for a generation of viewers who saw only the mask and not the carnage. The trial was not a question of did she do it. The evidence was an avalanche. Instead, the climax of the legal battle focused on the thin, gray line between evil and illness. The prosecution argued that the 79 stabs were the result of a simmering, narcissistic rage, the Black Widow instinct to eliminate an obstacle. They pointed to the email as proof of a cold-blooded plan. But the defense brought forth a series of experts who painted a picture of a mind that had completely untethered from reality. The court heard testimony about Isabella's behavior in the days leading up to the attack. She had been seen staring at walls, claiming that the woman she was living with was a biological imposter. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was not just a legal strategy. It was supported by state-appointed doctors who found that Isabella was suffering from severe delusions. In her mind, she wasn't killing her mother. She was fighting a war against a creature that had replaced her mother. The climax of the proceedings came when the judge delivered the verdict. Based on the overwhelming psychological evidence, Isabella Guzman was found not guilty by reason of insanity. In the eyes of the law, she was not a criminal to be punished, but a patient to be treated. She was sentenced to be committed to the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo for an indefinite period, not for a term of years, but until the state deemed her no longer a threat to society. The public reaction was a mix of shock and fury. For many, the image of her smirking in court was proof enough of her evil. They saw a girl who had manipulated the system, a femme fatale who had used her youth and beauty to escape the cage. But for those who understood the science of the mind, the verdict was a somber acknowledgement of a tragedy that had no winners. As she was led out of the courtroom, Isabella offered one last look at the cameras, a look that was neither remorseful nor defiant. It was simply empty. The trial had provided a conclusion, but not a resolution. The girl with the viral smile was gone, replaced by a permanent resident of a high-security psychiatric facility. The legal system had spoken, but the question of what truly lived behind that smile remained unanswered, hanging in the air of the courtroom long after the doors were locked. Today, Isabella Guzman remains behind the high walls of the Colorado Mental Health Institute, but the story didn't end with her commitment. In a digital twist of fate, her 2013 courtroom footage exploded into a viral phenomenon in 2020, garnering millions of views from a generation captivated by her eerie charm. To some, she is a misunderstood victim of her own mind. To others, she is the ultimate Black Widow who successfully wore a mask of madness to escape a life sentence. Isabella herself has recently sought release, claiming that medication has finally silenced the voices and cured the monster. But as she fights for her freedom, the haunting question remains. In a world where we only see what the lens captures, can you ever truly trust a recovered killer? Or is the smile she wears today just another layer of the mask she perfected 79 stabs ago? We are left to wonder if the girl who conquered TikTok is a tragedy of science or a triumph of cold, calculated deception. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. They say that still waters run deep, but they forget to mention what breathes beneath the surface. We are taught to look for monsters in the shadows, the disheveled, the desperate, the obviously broken. But the most dangerous predators don't hide in the dark. They hide in plain sight, wearing the face of a straight-A student, a devoted daughter, a woman with a bright future. In the quiet suburban streets of Highland Heights, Kentucky, that mask didn't just slip, it danced. Shayna Hubers was the girl who had everything: intelligence, beauty, and the kind of academic pedigree that opens every door. But when the man she claimed to love tried to close just one door on her, the golden girl vanished, and something ancient and hollow took her place. This is not just a story of a murder. It is a clinical descent into the mind of a woman who believed her ego was more precious than a human life. It is the story of a man who died because he dared to want a life without her, and a woman who spent her first hours of grief twirling in an interrogation room, more concerned with her reflection than the body cooling on a hardwood floor. Pour yourself a drink, dim the lights, let's look behind the mask. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, And please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the tragedy of Ryan Poston, one must first dismantle the myth of Shayna Hubers. We often search for a smoking gun in a killer's past, a history of abuse, a childhood of deprivation, or a sudden, traumatic break from reality. But Shayna's origin story offers no such easy comfort. She was born and raised in Lexington, Kentucky, in a world that felt as stable and polished as the hardwood floors she would eventually stain with blood. Her family was the definition of middle-class respectability. Her mother was a school teacher, her father a retired musician. There was music in the house, a premium on education, and an unwavering expectation of excellence. From the moment she entered the Kentucky public school system, Shayna didn't just participate, she dominated. She was the girl whose name was always on the honor roll, the one who sat in the front row, hand perpetually raised, eyes fixed on the teacher with an intensity that bordered on the performative. To her teachers, she was a dream. To her peers, she was a daunting presence. She wasn't just smart, she was aggressively intelligent. She didn't just want the A, she wanted the highest A in the class. She was a straight A student, an academic powerhouse who moved through her teenage years with the calculated precision of a chess grandmaster. But if you look closer at the archives of her youth, a pattern emerges. Not of a girl who loved to learn, but of a girl who loved to be perceived as the best. In a narcissistic psyche, achievement isn't a goal, it's a defensive wall. Every academic award, every high test score, and every praise-filled report card was a brick Shayna laid to protect a very fragile, very hollow core. She was building a persona of the golden girl, a woman of such intellectual and social standing that she would be untouchable. As she transitioned into her college years at Morehead State University, Shayna chose to major in psychology. It was a choice dripping with irony. While she studied the nuances of human behavior, the mechanics of empathy, and the triggers of the human mind, she was simultaneously perfecting her own ability to mimic them. Psychology gave her a vocabulary for her own manipulation. She didn't just feel emotions, she analyzed them as tools. She learned how people worked so she could better understand how to move them like pieces on a board. Those who knew her during this period describe a young woman who was intensely talkative, but the conversation was a one-way street. She would speak for hours about her own thoughts, her own beauty, and her own intellectual superiority. There was a clinical coldness to her vanity. She wasn't just vain in the way a teenager might be, she was preoccupied with her own legend. She would often comment on her own high IQ, as if her intelligence was a physical weapon she carried in her purse. In the humid Kentucky summers, as she approached her early 20s, the mask was at its most perfect. She was 5 feet, 8 inches of polished potential. She volunteered, she studied, she stayed out of trouble. On paper, she was the daughter every parent wanted. But the cracks were beginning to show in the way she handled rejection, or rather, the way she didn't. For Shayna, a B on a paper wasn't a mistake. It was an insult. A friend's disagreement wasn't a difference of opinion. It was a betrayal. She lived in a binary world. You were either a devotee to her brilliance, or you were an enemy to her ego. She was a woman who lived in the all or nothing. This rigidity is a hallmark of the narcissistic personality. When the world reflects your perfection back to you, you are charming, witty, and kind. But the moment the mirror cracks, the moment someone implies you are ordinary or worse, replaceable, the golden girl evaporates. By 2011, Shayna was 20 years old, standing on the precipice of adulthood. She had the grades, she had the looks, and she had the psychology of a predator. She was looking for a partner who could serve as a mirror, someone handsome enough, successful enough, and worthy enough to reflect her own perceived greatness back at her. She wasn't looking for love, she was looking for a male version of herself. She wanted a trophy that could also give her the validation she so desperately craved. It was during this time that her obsession with status reached its fever pitch. She was obsessed with the way she was perceived by men, often tracking her own desirability with a mathematical coldness. She was a woman who viewed relationships as a series of transactions. She would give her brilliance, and in return, she expected total, unwavering adoration. She was a ticking clock, though no one knew it yet. The academic success had given her a sense of omnipotence. She believed she could outthink anyone. She believed her straight A status made her morally superior. She was the perfect Kentucky girl, a product of a good home and a better education. But the foundation was built on sand. Beneath the honors degree and the practiced smile sat a deep, roiling sea of entitlement. She was waiting for the one person who would finally tell her no. She was waiting for the person who would dare to look at the golden girl and see something ordinary. And then, through the digital ether of Facebook, she found Ryan Poston. Ryan was everything she wanted on paper. He was 29, a successful lawyer, tall and classically handsome. He was the prize. When they began talking, Shayna didn't just see a boyfriend. She saw the ultimate validation of her own status. If a man like Ryan Poston wanted her, then she truly was the queen of the room. But what Ryan didn't realize, what he couldn't have known as he typed those first few messages, was that he wasn't entering a romance. He was entering a cage. Shayna Hubers had spent 20 years perfecting the role of the perfect woman. She had studied the scripts, she had learned the cues, and she had built the set. Now she finally had her leading man. The tragedy was that in Shayna's world, the leading man only has two options. He can stay on script and adore her forever, or he can be written out of the story entirely. As the winter of 2011 turned into the spring of 2012, the Golden Girl was ready for her greatest performance. And the setting, a quiet apartment in Highland Heights, was already being prepared for the final, bloody act. The initial spark between Shayna Hubers and Ryan Poston didn't ignite in a crowded room or through a chance encounter at a Lexington coffee shop. It began in the curated digital world of Facebook, a medium perfectly suited for a narcissist to craft a persona. In the beginning, it was a high-octane intellectual pursuit. Ryan was a 29-year-old attorney with a sharp legal mind and a pedigree from the Salmon P. Chase College of Law. Shayna was the 21-year-old honors student who could keep up with his wit, match his vocabulary, and provide the kind of intense, flattering attention that can be mistaken for soulmate-level passion. But for Shayna, Ryan wasn't just a partner, he was an acquisition. To have a successful, handsome lawyer on her arm was the ultimate social currency in the hills of northern Kentucky. It validated everything she believed about herself, that she was elite, that she was desirable, and that she belonged in the upper echelons of society. However, the honeymoon phase was not a period of growth, but the beginning of an encroaching fog. Shayna's love was not a gift, it was a tax. The cracks in the relationship appeared almost immediately, though they were often disguised as passion or intensity. Shayna didn't just want to be part of Ryan's life, she wanted to be the only thing in it. Her need for validation was a bottomless pit that no man could ever hope to fill. If Ryan was at work, she was texting. If he was with his family, she was calling. If he was asleep, she was monitoring his social media. She was a woman who translated any moment of his independence as a direct act of psychological violence against her. As 2012 progressed, the dynamic shifted from romantic to predatory. Ryan, a man known for his laid-back demeanor and love for his family, began to feel the walls closing in. He tried to end the relationship dozens of times. He would tell her it wasn't working, that they were too different, that the intensity was too much. But in the mind of a malignant narcissist like Shayna, no is not an answer. It is a challenge. Every time Ryan tried to break free, Shayna would pivot. She would use her psychology background to manipulate his guilt. She would threaten self-harm, she would show up at his doorstep at 3 a.m., or she would use sex as a tether to pull him back into her orbit. The digital evidence recovered later would show a woman who had transformed from a girlfriend into a stalker. She sent him over 100 texts a day. When he didn't respond, the tone shifted from "I love you" to "I hate you" within minutes. She was obsessed with his vanity, often projecting her own insecurities onto him. She would criticize his looks, his career, and his family, all while refusing to let him go. She was devaluing him so that he would feel he had no choice but to stay with her. It was a classic Black Widow maneuver. Paralyze the prey so they can't fly away. By the summer of 2012, Ryan was living in a state of constant anxiety. He told his friends he was scared of her. He changed the locks on his condominium in Highland Heights. He told his father, Jay Poston, that Shayna was crazy and that he couldn't get her to leave him alone. Yet Shayna's public mask remained flawlessly in place. To her professors and family, she was still the bright, achieving student. But behind closed doors, she was a woman obsessed with the script. If Ryan wouldn't play the role of the adoring husband-to-be, she would rewrite the ending of the play. The ultimate motive for the murder wasn't jealousy, it was narcissistic injury. A narcissist's greatest fear is not being unloved, it is being irrelevant. It is being told that they are not special. When Ryan finally made it clear that he was moving on, specifically when he made plans to meet Audrey Bolt, a Miss Ohio contestant, he did the one thing Shayna could not forgive. He chose someone else. He chose a woman whose beauty was officially certified by a crown. To Shayna, this was a personal execution of her ego. If Ryan left her for a beauty queen, it proved that Shayna was less than. In her mind, the logic was chillingly simple. If she could not own the mirror that reflected her greatness, she would smash it so no one else could look into it. She began to prep her defense long before she ever touched a gun. She texted friends about how mean Ryan was. She hinted that he was abusive, despite there being no evidence of physical violence on his part. She was building a narrative of self-defense as a contingency plan. She even joked to a friend that she could shoot him and get away with it because of her clean record. She wasn't an impulsive killer. She was a cold-blooded tactician who viewed the legal system as just another test she could ace. As the date of October 12, 2012 approached, the Black Widow had spun her web. She knew Ryan was going on a date that night. She knew he would be getting ready, feeling happy, feeling free. And that freedom was an insult she intended to correct. She didn't want his money. She didn't want his house. She wanted his life because he had dared to tell her that she wasn't enough. She spent the days leading up to the murder in a state of high-functioning rage. To the world, she was just a student walking across campus with her books. But inside, she was calculating the distance, the angles, and the story. She was a psychology major who had decided that the ultimate psychological experiment was to see if she could kill a man and make the world weep for her. The golden girl was gone. The predator was hungry, and Ryan Poston was about to pay the ultimate price for wanting a life of his own. The air in Kentucky was getting colder as October took hold, but inside Shayna Huber's, the temperature had already dropped to absolute zero. She wasn't going to his apartment to talk. She wasn't going to plead for one last chance. She was going to ensure that Ryan Poston's last memory was her face, and that he would never have the chance to look at another woman again. The motive was vanity, the method was execution, and the result was a tragedy that Highland Heights would never forget. Friday, October 12, 2012. The sun began its slow descent over Highland Heights, Kentucky, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawns and brick facades of the condominium complex on Carruthers Road. The temperature was a mild 62 degrees Fahrenheit, a perfect, crisp autumn evening that should have been the backdrop for a new beginning. Inside Unit 201, 29-year-old Ryan Poston was moving with a lightness he hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. He was a man who had finally stepped out from under a heavy, suffocating shroud. He was trimming his beard in the bathroom mirror, selecting a clean shirt and checking his watch. In a few hours, he was supposed to meet Audrey Bolte for drinks. He wasn't just going on a date, he was reclaiming his identity from the woman who had tried to consume it. But at 8:50 p.m., the peace was shattered by a sound that Ryan had grown to dread, the specific rhythm of a knock that belonged to only one person. Shayna Hubers had arrived. She didn't come with flowers or an apology. She didn't come to talk in any traditional sense. She entered the apartment like a ghost returning to a house it refused to leave. When she stepped across the threshold, the very air in the room seemed to thin. Ryan, ever the gentleman, perhaps to his ultimate detriment, allowed her in. He sat at his dining room table, his laptop open, his mind likely already halfway to his date. He was exhausted by her. He didn't want to fight. He wanted a finale. But for Shayna, the finale had to be written on her terms. For the next 15 to 20 minutes, the apartment became a pressure cooker of narcissistic rage and desperate indifference. Shayna began her usual routine, the accusations, the pleas, the demands for attention. She would later claim he was mean to her, that he called her names and tried to push her out. But forensic evidence and Ryan's own history suggest a man who was simply profoundly done. He wasn't yelling, he was ignoring her. And to a woman like Shayna, being ignored is a fate worse than death. It is the ultimate narcissistic injury. As Ryan sat there, perhaps looking down at his phone, the Golden Girl reached for the weapon. It was Ryan's own gun, a .38 caliber Sig Sauer, kept in the apartment for protection. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. She moved with the cold, rhythmic precision of a person who had already played this scene 1,000 times in the theater of her mind. The first shot was a thunderclap that tore through the domestic stillness. The bullet struck Ryan squarely in the face. It was a horrific, disfiguring wound that shattered his jaw and sent him spiraling from his chair to the floor. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the walls, followed by a silence so heavy it felt physical. In a normal person, the sight of the man they loved with half his face destroyed would trigger a primal scream, a frantic reach for a telephone, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. But Shayna Hubers didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood over him. The smell of cordite, sharp, metallic, and sulfurous, filled the small dining area. Ryan was on the floor, his body twitching in a reflexive, agonizing struggle for life. He was moaning, a sound Shayna would later describe to police with a chilling lack of empathy. She watched him. She observed his suffering as if she were a scientist watching a specimen under a microscope. And then she decided that he hadn't been corrected enough. She fired again, and again, and again. The second bullet entered his back as he lay face down. The third and fourth followed, tearing into his side and chest. She was finishing him off. 6 shots in total were fired into the body of a man who was already defeated by the first. Each pull of the trigger was a punctuation mark on her narrative. She wasn't just killing him, she was erasing the version of him that dared to reject her. There is a specific sensory hell to those minutes after the final shot. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the kitchen lights and the flickering screen of the laptop Ryan would never use again. The only sound was the heavy, wet rhythm of blood meeting the hardwood, and the distant, muffled sounds of neighbors who had no idea that a life had just been extinguished a few feet away. Shayna stood in the center of the carnage, the gun heavy in her hand. She wasn't in a state of heat of passion. She was in a state of total, absolute control. She would later tell the police, with a disturbing, almost playful tilt of her head, that she gave him the nose job he always wanted. It is perhaps one of the most famous and most repulsive lines in the history of true crime. It reveals the core of her motive: spite. Even as she killed him, she was mocking his appearance, reducing his humanity to a cosmetic flaw she felt empowered to fix with a bullet. But what did she do in the minutes between the final shot and the call to 911. This is where the slow burn horror of the case truly lies. Most killers flee or immediately call for help in a panic. Shayna waited. She spent 10 to 15 minutes alone with the corpse of Ryan Poston. She didn't try to save him. She didn't hold his hand. She likely spent those minutes composing herself. She needed to transition from the executioner back into the victim. She had to rehearse the shaky voice, the terrified cadence, the I had no choice defense. When she finally picked up the phone at 8:53 p.m., the performance began. "I killed my boyfriend," she told the dispatcher. Her voice wasn't the scream of a woman who had just survived a life-and-death struggle. It was flat. It was calculated. It was the voice of a student turning in a difficult assignment. As the first responders raced toward Carruthers Road, Shayna didn't use the time to pray. She didn't use it to weep. She stood in the apartment, surrounded by the physical evidence of her cruelty, and waited for her audience to arrive. She was about to be the center of attention, the protagonist of a tragedy that she had directed, produced, and starred in. The sensory details of the scene when police arrived were haunting. The officers found a young woman who was remarkably calm. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no bruises on her skin, just a dead man on the floor, and a young woman who seemed more concerned about the blood on her clothes than the blood on the floor. "I'm not a murderer," she would later say. "I'm a survivor." But as the police began to process the scene, the Day X chronology revealed the truth. The shots were fired from a distance that precluded a struggle. The angles proved he was sitting or lying down when hit. The sheer number of bullets, 6, shouted the word execution. Ryan Poston had been murdered in his own home while getting ready for a date by a woman who believed that if she couldn't have his heart, she was entitled to his head. The sun had fully set now. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers danced against the windows of Unit 201, a strobe light of suburban nightmare. As Shayna was led out in handcuffs, she didn't look back at the home where Ryan lay. She looked at the cameras. She looked at the officers. She was already thinking about the interrogation room. She was already preparing for the dance. The Day X didn't end with a bang. It ended with the cold, metallic click of handcuffs and the realization that for Shayna Hubers, the death of Ryan Poston was just the beginning of her new, more famous life. She had traded a boyfriend for a legacy of infamy, and she didn't seem to mind the price at all. The sirens had faded into the background hum of the Highland Heights night, replaced by the sterile, fluorescent buzz of the police station. Shayna Hubers sat in an interrogation room, a small, windowless box where the air always feels a few degrees too cold and the clock on the wall ticks with an accusatory rhythm. Most people brought into these rooms after a fatal shooting are catatonic, trembling, or draped in the heavy shroud of shock. But Shayna was just getting warmed up. The mask of the grieving girlfriend was already beginning to slip, not because she was cracking under pressure, but because she couldn't resist the urge to perform. As the detective stepped out of the room, leaving the cameras to roll, the world was granted a front-row seat to one of the most disturbing displays of narcissistic detachment ever captured on film. She didn't pace in circles out of guilt. She didn't collapse in prayer. Instead, she stood up and began to dance. With the blood of Ryan Poston quite literally still under her fingernails, Shayna twirled. She sang to herself, fragments of Amazing Grace and I Feel Pretty, as if the interrogation room were a backstage dressing room and the murder of her boyfriend was merely the opening act of her rise to fame. It was a vaudeville of the macabre. She checked her reflection in the two-way glass, smoothing her hair, adjusting her glasses, ensuring that even in the wake of a homicide, she remained camera-ready. When the detectives returned, the dialogue shifted from the tragic to the surreal. Shayna didn't ask if Ryan had a chance of survival. She didn't ask about his family. Instead, she spoke about herself, incessantly. She worried aloud about how this incident would affect her reputation. She lamented that it would be difficult to find a new husband now, because she was a murderer. She spoke about the stigma as if it were a stain on a designer dress rather than a life sentence for taking a human life. "He's very vain," she told the officers, speaking of the man she had just shot 6 times. "He's got a nose job, or he wanted one, and I shot him right here. I gave him the nose job he wanted." The detectives, seasoned men who had seen the worst of Kentucky's underbelly, sat in stunned silence. There was no heat of passion here. There was no fear for her life. There was only a cold, vibrating arrogance. She described the act of finishing him off with the same emotional weight one might use to describe discarding a piece of broken furniture. She told them he was moaning on the floor, and so she shot him again to end his suffering, not out of mercy, but out of a desire for the noise to stop. The suspicions didn't just crawl into the room, they slammed the door shut. Her version of events, a harrowing tale of self-defense against a man twice her size, began to crumble under the weight of her own vanity. She claimed Ryan was abusive, yet she was the one who had forced her way into his home. She claimed she was terrified, yet she spent her solo time in the interrogation room laughing and snapping her fingers. To the police, it became clear. This wasn't a woman who had survived an attack. This was a woman who had executed a plan and was now annoyed that the paperwork was taking so long. Outside the station, the news was beginning to break. Ryan Poston's family was receiving the kind of phone call that stops time. Their son, the brilliant attorney, the man who was supposed to meet a date that night and start a new chapter, was gone. And as they mourned, the woman who had ended him was complaining to the police about the stigma of her new title. The first red flags for the investigators weren't just in her words, but in her physical presence. There were no defensive wounds on Shayna, no bruises, no scratches, no signs of the struggle she so vividly described. Her clothes were neat, save for the blood spatter that told a much more violent story than her testimony. She sat 5 feet, 8 inches tall, a woman of intellect and physical capability, yet she played the fragile girl card until the moment it no longer served her. As the sun began to rise over Kentucky, the reality of what had happened in that Highland Heights apartment was coming into focus. This wasn't a case of still waters run deep. This was a shallow pool with a jagged, lethal bottom. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a victim of domestic strife. They were dealing with a malignant narcissist, a woman who believed that if she couldn't have Ryan's devotion, she was entitled to his pulse. "I'm a very intelligent person," she told the camera when left alone again. "I have a very high IQ." It was her favorite refrain. But she was about to learn that all the intelligence in the world couldn't erase the forensic truth. She had shot a man in the back. She had shot a man while he was down. And most damning of all, she had danced while his body was still warm. The mask was off, and beneath it lay a void that no amount of straight-A logic could fill. The investigation was no longer about who did it. It was about proving that the girl who felt pretty was actually a cold-blooded executioner. The detectives of the Highland Heights Police Department didn't need to look far to find a suspect, but they needed to look deep to find the truth. Shayna Hubers had already given them hours of footage, a confession of sorts, and a weapon, but she had also given them a meticulously crafted lie. The exposure phase of the case became a clinical deconstruction of that lie, pitting the forensic reality of a crime scene against the shifting narratives of a narcissist. The first blow to Shayna's self-defense story came from the ballistics report. Forensic investigators spent days inside Ryan's apartment, using laser trajectory kits to map the path of the 6 bullets. In a genuine case of self-defense, there is usually evidence of a struggle: overturned chairs, scuff marks on the floor, or defensive wounds on the survivor. There was none of that in Unit 201. Instead, the evidence suggested a stationary target. The most damning revelation was the location of the wounds. Ryan had been shot while he was sitting down. The angle of the first shot to his face indicated that the shooter was standing above him while he was in a seated, non-threatening position. Furthermore, the shots to his back and side proved that he was either turning away or already on the ground when the final rounds were fired. This wasn't a woman fighting for her life. This was an executioner ensuring her victim couldn't get back up. But the physical evidence was only half the story. To prove the malignant nature of the crime, investigators had to dive into the digital abyss Shayna had left behind. They subpoenaed her phone records and social media accounts, uncovering a year-long campaign of psychological terrorism. The straight-A student was revealed to be a relentless stalker. She had sent Ryan thousands of text messages, sometimes over 100 in a single day, ranging from desperate pleas for affection to vitriolic insults. In one particularly chilling exchange with a friend months before the murder, Shayna openly discussed the idea of killing Ryan. She joked about how she could make it look like self-defense, claiming that because she had no criminal record and Ryan was big, people would believe her. She was premeditating her defense before she had even finalized the crime. It was a textbook display of proactive aggression, a hallmark of narcissistic personality disorder, where the individual plans a violent act to resolve a perceived slight to their ego. The investigators also looked into the abuse Shayna claimed she suffered. They interviewed Ryan's colleagues, his family, and his friends. The portrait that emerged was not of an abuser, but of a victim of high-stakes harassment. Ryan's friends testified that he was terrified of Shayna. He had changed his locks, he had avoided her calls, and he had even sought advice on how to legally keep her away from his home. He was the one being controlled. She was the one holding the leash. As the case moved toward the grand jury, the exposure turned to Shayna's behavior while in custody. Jailhouse informants came forward, claiming that Shayna didn't act like a woman traumatized by a life-altering event. Instead, she reportedly bragged about the murder, mocking Ryan's final moments and expressing zero remorse for his family's pain. She was obsessed with how she appeared on the news, asking if she looked pretty in her mugshot, and wondering if the media would realize how high her IQ was. The detectives realized they weren't just dealing with a murderer, they were dealing with a woman who lacked the basic biological equipment for empathy. Every tear she shed in the interrogation room was analyzed and found to be dry. Every shaking hand was found to be a performance. The exposure was complete. The Golden Girl was a fabrication. Beneath the academic honors and the middle-class upbringing lay a predator who viewed human beings as disposable objects. The investigation had stripped away her shield of perfection, leaving her standing in the harsh light of a Kentucky courtroom where the straight-A student was about to face the ultimate test of her life. The Campbell County Courthouse became the stage for a legal battle that would twice captivate the state of Kentucky. In 2015, the first trial of Shayna Hubers officially began. For the prosecution, led by Michelle Snodgrass, the mission was clear: pull back the curtain on the Golden Girl and show the jury the cold-blooded tactician beneath. For the defense, the strategy was to lean into the shattered victim narrative, claiming Shayna suffered from battered woman syndrome and acted out of a desperate primal fear for her life. However, the courtroom didn't just hear testimony, it watched a performance. The prosecution's most powerful evidence wasn't a witness, it was the interrogation tapes. The jury sat in a silence so thick it was suffocating as they watched Shayna twirl, snap her fingers, and sing to herself in the hours following Ryan's death. They heard her clinical, detached voice describe the nose job she gave him. The defense's claim of fear evaporated when contrasted with the footage of a woman who seemed more concerned with her hair than the life she had just extinguished. One by one, Ryan's friends and family took the stand. They spoke of a man who was gentle, professional, and increasingly desperate to escape Shayna's suffocating grip. They dismantled the abuser narrative brick by brick, painting a picture of a man who was being hunted, not a man who was hunting. Then came the forensic experts. They used a mannequin to demonstrate how Ryan was seated, vulnerable and unthreatening, when the first bullet shattered his face. They showed the jury the bullet in his back. The science was undeniable. This was an execution. Shayna herself took the stand, a move that backfired with spectacular precision. She was loquacious, often speaking in a superior academic tone that seemed to grate on the jury's nerves. She attempted to intellectualize her violence, using her psychology background to justify her actions. But under cross-examination, the mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Her high IQ couldn't save her from the common sense of 12 citizens who saw a killer where she saw a survivor. The first jury found her guilty of murder, recommending a 40-year sentence. But then, a legal anomaly occurred. It was discovered that one of the jurors was a convicted felon, which disqualified them from service under Kentucky law. The verdict was thrown out. For Ryan's family, it was a cruel secondary trauma. They would have to endure the entire grisly process all over again. The second trial in 2018 was even more intense. The prosecution was leaner and more aggressive. They introduced new evidence of Shayna's jailhouse behavior, where she reportedly bragged about the nose job and mocked the legal system. The defense tried a different angle, focusing on her mental state, but the result was the same. The second jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning the same verdict: guilty. The climax reached its peak during the sentencing phase. Judge Fred Stein, who had presided over the case for years, spoke with a weary, righteous anger. He noted the total lack of remorse, the cold calculation, and the devastating overkill of the crime. Under the American justice system, for the crime of murder, Shayna Hubers was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Shayna's face remained a mask of defiance. There were no tears for Ryan. There were no apologies to his parents. She walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, a straight-A student who had finally failed the only test that mattered. The legal battle was over, but the damage she had wrought was permanent. The interrogation dancer had been sentenced to a life of silence, leaving the world to wonder how someone so bright could be so utterly dark. The story of Shayna Hubers remains a haunting monument to the terrifying vanity of the modern age. Today, the woman who once defined herself by her high IQ and academic accolades resides within the walls of the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women. There, her straight-A record is irrelevant, and her pretty face is just a number in a system that does not care about her reflection. She remains a textbook case for criminal psychologists, a chilling study in how a high-functioning mask can conceal a hollow, predatory core. Ryan Poston's legacy is not found in the violence of his end, but in the silence that followed. He was a man who wanted nothing more than to live a life of his own choosing, a right that was stolen by someone who believed she owned his very existence. This case serves as a grim reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it twirls in an interrogation room and sings to itself while the world weeps. We are left with the image of that small, windowless room, the dance of a narcissist who thought she could outsmart the truth. Shayna Hubers proved that intelligence without empathy is not brilliance, it is a weapon. As the heavy doors of justice closed, they left behind a sobering lesson. We must look past the polished surface of the perfect person, for beneath the stillest waters, the most patient monsters are often waiting for their turn to dance. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.